Welcome to another exciting episode on the Fiction Wizard. Today, we're exploring a captivating tale called What If Fred Weasley Never Died? The wedding George missed. Before we begin, if you enjoy our content, please support us by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It helps more than you know. And now, the story awaits. Chapter 1, Twin Decisions. The early morning sun crept through the windows of Weasley's wizard wheezes, casting colorful prisms across the shop floor as light bounced off the various magical trinkets and bottled potions. Fred Weasley flicked his wand at the front door, unlocking it with a satisfying click before turning to face his twin brother. "George! Where'd you put the new batch of extendable ears? The ones with the translation charms built in?" Fred called out, absently running his fingers along the jagged scar that stretched from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of how close he'd come to death 5 years ago during the Battle of Hogwarts. George emerged from the back room, his arms loaded with boxes of merchandise. The absence of his left ear was barely noticeable these days, his ginger hair grown just long enough to cover the hole. "They're in the blue crates beneath the counter. And before you ask, yes, I already checked that they won't translate everything into Mermish like the prototype did. One mishap and you never let me forget it," Fred grinned, catching the pygmy puff that had escaped its cage and was bouncing toward the door. Poor Percy's face when his wedding toast came out as screeching. "Audrey still brings it up at every family dinner." George set down his boxes and began sorting through their latest creations. "Speaking of which, Mum's expecting us for dinner tonight. Something about Bill and Fleur's big announcement." Fred nodded, distracted as he checked his pocket watch, a gift from Angelina on their 3rd anniversary. Yeah. Listen, I might be late. Got that meeting with our investor from Japan. If we land this deal, we'll have shops in 3 continents, George finished. "I know. Just don't leave me alone with Mum asking when I'm going to settle down like everyone else." The shop bell jingled as their first customer of the day entered, a frazzled-looking wizard with a toddler who immediately made a beeline for the display of toy wands that turned into rubber chickens when waved. "Welcome to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes," the twins chorused, slipping effortlessly into their shopkeeper personas. 5 years after the war, business was booming. What had started as a small joke shop in Diagon Alley had expanded into a magical empire. Their Hogsmeade branch was managed by Lee Jordan, while Verity oversaw their newest location in Dublin. They'd even started mail-order catalogs for customers in America and Australia. The morning passed in a whirlwind of customers, product demonstrations, and one minor explosion when a young witch tried to combine Peruvian instant darkness powder with a decoy detonator. By lunchtime, Fred was checking his watch every few minutes, his usual boundless energy tinged with something George hadn't seen before, nervousness. "All right, what's got your wand in a knot?" George asked after they'd handed the shop over to their employees for the lunch rush. "You keep looking at that watch like it might bite you." Fred ran a hand through his hair, making it stand on end. "Nothing. Everything. I don't know." George raised his eyebrows. "Well, that clears things up. I'm asking Angelina to marry me tonight," Fred blurted out. George froze, a butterbeer halfway to his lips. For a split second, something flickered across his face, surprise, confusion, maybe even a touch of something deeper, before his features rearranged into a wide grin. "Bloody hell. That's fantastic." He clapped Fred on the shoulder. "About time, I'd say. You've only been mad for her since what, 5th year?" "4th, Fred corrected, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "D'you think she'll like it?" "I had Fleur help me pick it out, she swore me to secrecy," said women have a sixth sense about these things. George took the box and opened it. Inside sat a delicate gold ring with a small ruby surrounded by tiny diamonds that occasionally emitted little sparks. "It's charmed to emit fireworks when she says yes," Fred explained, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Not actual explosives, just little light shows. Nothing that'll set her eyebrows on fire or anything." "Learning from past mistakes, I see," George joked, remembering the disastrous Valentine's gift from 3 years ago. "It's perfect, Fred. She'll love it." Fred took back the box, his fingers fidgeting with the clasp. "This changes things, doesn't it? Between us, I mean." George's smile softened. "Maybe. But not the important stuff." He gestured to the shop around them. "We're still partners in crime, aren't we?" "Always," Fred agreed, relief evident in his voice. "I just never thought I'd be the first of us to get married. Always figured you'd beat me to it." "Me?" George laughed. "With who? I spend all my free time inventing joke products with my less handsome twin." "Less handsome? We're identical." "Not anymore, mate." George pointed to Fred's scar. "The ladies love a battle wound. My missing ear is old news." Their banter was interrupted by an employee poking her head through the doorway. "Mr. Weasley. There's a gentleman here asking about a bulk order of shield cloaks for the Auror office." "Which Mr. Weasley?" they asked in unison. Either one." "I've got it," George said, standing up. "You need to prepare for tonight anyway. Got a plan for how you're asking her?" Fred's grin turned mischievous. "Remember that enchanted swamp we left in Umbridge's corridor?" "You're not proposing in a swamp," George said flatly. "Not exactly. I've been working with McGonagall, got permission to set up something at Hogwarts, where we first met Angelina." Fred's expression softened. "It'll be perfect." As George headed back to the shop floor, Fred called after him, "Don't forget dinner tonight. I'll need my best man there when I tell the family." George gave a thumbs up without turning around, ignoring the strange twinge in his chest. His twin was getting married. Of course he was happy for him, thrilled, even. So why did it feel like something fundamental was shifting beneath his feet? Angelina Johnson's day had been perfectly ordinary until her boyfriend sent her a Patronus message asking her to meet him at Hogwarts that evening. The Silver Fox had appeared in the middle of her Quidditch training session with the Holyhead Harpies reserve team, causing her to nearly fall off her broom in surprise. "What's that about?" her teammate Gwendolyn asked as they headed to the showers after practice. "No idea," Angelina admitted, unwrapping her wrist guards. "It's Fred, though. Could be anything from a romantic surprise to testing some new prank product he needs a second opinion on." "5 Galleons says he's finally proposing," Gwendolyn wagered with a knowing smile. Angelina rolled her eyes, but couldn't completely suppress her smile. "We've only been together for 4 years. 4 years, 3 months, and about 2 weeks, but who's counting?" Gwendolyn teased. "And you've known each other since you were 11. "We'll see," Angelina replied, though her heart had begun beating faster at the possibility. After showering and changing into casual robes, she apparat to Hogsmeade and made the familiar walk up to the castle. Hogwarts had been fully restored after the battle, though subtle changes remained, new stonework that hadn't yet weathered to match the old, a memorial garden where part of the courtyard had once been, and an atmosphere of renewed purpose. As she approached the entrance hall, she spotted a familiar figure leaning against the great oak doors, his red hair gleaming in the setting sun. "George," she called out, surprised. He turned, revealing the intact ear that identified him as Fred, not George. "Expecting my better-looking half?" he asked with a grin. "Just surprised. Your message was mysterious enough that I half expected both of you to jump out with some new Weez's product that turns my hair purple." "The night is young," Fred quipped, taking her hand. "But I have something else in mind first. Come on." He led her through the castle, greeting the occasional teacher or ghost they passed. Angelina noticed he seemed unusually focused, the typical Weasley twin mischief temporarily subdued. "Are we going to the Quidditch pitch?" she asked when they headed toward the grounds. "Not quite." Fred guided her toward the lake, where the sunset had painted the water in shades of orange and gold. As they approached, Angelina gasped. Floating just above the surface of the lake was what appeared to be a miniature version of the Hogwarts Express, complete in every detail except size to hold just 2 people. "Fred, what is this?" "Remember our first trip to Hogwarts?" he asked, helping her step into the floating carriage. "We met in compartment D, third from the front. You and George were trying to convince Lee that you could make his tarantula tap dance," she recalled, smiling at the memory. "And you told us we were idiots, but asked to see it anyway," Fred continued, climbing in beside her. "You've been telling me I'm an idiot and encouraging me anyway ever since." The miniature train began to move, gliding smoothly across the lake's surface. "We're breaking about 15 school rules right now," Angelina noted, leaning into him. "McGonagall must really like you." "She's gone soft in her old age," Fred agreed, draping his arm around her shoulders. "Or maybe she just appreciates that our products saved lives during the battle." A shadow crossed his face, as it sometimes did when the war was mentioned. Angelina reached up to trace the scar on his face gently. "You know, I sometimes think about how close I came to losing you that day," she said softly. "When they brought you in." Fred caught her hand and kissed her palm, cutting off the painful memory. "But you didn't. I'm right here, annoying you with elaborate romantic gestures and dangerous magical contraptions." The train completed its circuit of the lake and began to emit colorful smoke in red and gold. As it reached the center of the lake, it came to a gentle stop, and words formed in the smoke above them, "Will you marry me?" Angelina turned to find Fred holding out the open ring box, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "Angelina Johnson," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous bobbing of his Adam's apple, "I've been in love with you since I was 14 years old and too stupid to know what to do about it. Will you make me the happiest prankster in Britain and be my wife?" For a moment, Angelina simply stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. Then she laughed, a bright, joyous sound that echoed across the lake. "Yes," she said, throwing her arms around him. "Yes, of course I will, you ridiculous man." As he slid the ring onto her finger, it erupted in miniature fireworks, tiny sparkles that danced around them like fireflies. In the distance, real fireworks suddenly exploded over the forbidden forest, spelling out "She said yes" in giant letters. "How did you know I would?" she asked, admiring the ring's sparkle. Fred grinned, his confidence returned. "I didn't. George is hiding in the trees with the fireworks. If you'd said no, they were charmed to spell out, 'Better luck next time' instead." Angelina laughed again and pulled him in for a kiss as their floating train began to make its way back to shore, where several teachers had gathered to watch the display. Miss Johnson, Mr. Weasley, Professor McGonagall greeted them as they disembarked, her severe expression belied by the slight upturn of her lips. "Congratulations are in order, I believe." "Thank you, Professor," Fred replied, his arm tight around Angelina's waist. "And thanks for letting me break curfew one last time." "I expect an invitation to the wedding," McGonagall sniffed, though her eyes twinkled. "And perhaps a discount on those shield hats. The first years keep setting things on fire in charms class." As they walked back toward Hogsmeade to apparate home, Angelina nudged Fred with her shoulder. "So, George was in on it?" "Of course. Couldn't have pulled it off without him." Fred checked his watch. "He should be meeting us at the Burrow by now. Mum's going to go mental when we tell everyone." The Burrow was already bustling with activity when Fred and Angelina arrived hand in hand. The entire Weasley clan had gathered for the weekly family dinner, which had become tradition after the war. Bill and Fleur were there with their 3-year-old daughter Victoire, who was chasing gnomes in the garden under Percy's watchful eye. Charlie had flood in from Romania for the weekend, deep in conversation with Arthur about some new Muggle invention. Ron and Hermione were helping Molly in the kitchen, while Harry and Ginny set the table. George, however, was conspicuously absent. "Fred. Angelina. Come in," Molly called, wiping her hands on her apron as she rushed to greet them. "We were about to send out a search party." "Sorry, Mum. Had some business to take care of," Fred said with a wink at Angelina, who squeezed his hand. "Where's George?" Fred asked, looking around for his twin. "Not here yet," Ron answered, levitating a stack of plates to the expanded dining table. "Said something about finishing inventory at the shop." Fred frowned. "That's odd. He was supposed to." He was interrupted by Victoire, who had abandoned the gnomes and was now tugging at his robes. "Uncle Fred." "Up," she demanded, raising her arms. Fred obliged, swinging her up onto his shoulders. "There you go, Princess Vicky. Better view from up here, isn't it? Has everyone heard Bill and Fleur's news?" Percy asked as he joined the group, his wife Audrey beside him. "Not yet," Bill called from across the room. "We're waiting until everyone's here." Fred exchanged a glance with Angelina, silently communicating. She nodded slightly, and he grinned. "Well, while we're waiting for George, Angelina and I have some news of our own," he announced, setting Victoire back down. All eyes turned to them, and Molly's hands flew to her mouth as she noticed the ring sparkling on Angelina's finger. "We're engaged," Angelina declared, holding up her hand. The room erupted in cheers and congratulations. Molly burst into tears and enveloped them both in a bone-crushing hug, while Arthur clapped Fred on the back repeatedly. The others gathered around, examining the ring and offering their congratulations. "About time, mate," Ron said, punching Fred lightly on the arm. "When's the wedding?" Ginny asked, hugging Angelina. "We haven't set a date yet," Fred replied, glancing at the door. "Just happened tonight, actually. George helped with the proposal. I can't believe he's not here." As if summoned by his name, the door burst open and George stumbled in, looking disheveled. His robes were singed at the edges, and a thin cut marked his cheek. "Sorry I'm late," he panted, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Fred and Angelina. His face split into a grin. "She said yes, then." "She did," Fred confirmed, brow furrowed with concern. "What happened to you?" "Nothing major," George shrugged, accepting a handkerchief from Hermione to dab at the cut on his face. "Had a bit of trouble with one of the new products. Turns out decoy detonators don't mix well with Peruvian darkness powder." Fred's eyes narrowed slightly. They'd known that for years, but before he could question further, Molly was ushering everyone to the table. "Come on, everyone. Dinner's ready, and we have not one but two announcements to celebrate tonight." As they settled around the magically expanded table, Fred found himself between Angelina and George. Under the table, he nudged George with his elbow. "You all right?" he murmured while the others were distracted by Bill standing to make his announcement. "Course," George replied, his usual easy grin in place. "Why wouldn't I be? My favorite twins getting married to the most beautiful chaser Gryffindor ever had. You know you're still my best man, right?" Fred said, studying his brother's face. "Wouldn't have it any other way." Their conversation was interrupted as Bill cleared his throat. "Fleur and I are pleased to announce," Bill began, his scarred face glowing with pride as he placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, "that Victoire will be getting a little brother or sister in about 6 months. Another round of cheers filled the burrow. Molly was beside herself with joy, alternating between hugging Fleur and examining the diamond on Angelina's finger. 2 announcements in one night. Arthur exclaimed, raising his goblet. "To new beginnings. To new beginnings." Everyone echoed, clinking glasses. As the family settled into dinner, conversation flowed freely around marriage plans and baby names. George participated enthusiastically, offering increasingly outrageous suggestions for wedding pranks and unsuitable baby names, but Fred noticed his twins' laugh didn't quite reach his eyes. Later, as they helped clear the table, Fred cornered George in the kitchen. "Seriously, what's going on? And don't give me that rubbish about product testing." George sighed, glancing around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "It's nothing, really. Just some weird stuff happening at the shop lately. Inventory going missing, deliveries getting mixed up." "Why didn't you tell me?" Fred demanded. Because you've been planning the world's most elaborate proposal for weeks, George replied with a small smile. Didn't want to distract you. Fred hesitated, torn between concern for his twin and the joy of the evening. We'll figure it out tomorrow, yeah. First thing in the morning, we'll go through everything together. Yeah, sure, George agreed, clapping Fred on the shoulder. Now go back to your fiancée. She keeps looking over here like she's afraid I'm telling you to run for the hills. Fred laughed and rejoined the celebration, but throughout the evening, he caught George watching the family with an uncharacteristically pensive expression. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations and business as usual at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Molly had immediately taken charge of the planning, creating massive lists of guests, potential venues, and menu options. Angelina, to her credit, took it all in stride, agreeing to many of Molly's suggestions while firmly putting her foot down on others. I am not having garden gnomes as centerpieces, no matter how much Fred thinks they'd liven up the reception, she told George one afternoon as they sat in the flat above the shop, surrounded by wedding magazines and sample invitation cards. Shame, George replied, flipping through a catalog of enchanted wedding decorations. They'd definitely make things more interesting when the dancing starts. Fred emerged from the back room, his arms loaded with ledgers. Found the accounts from last quarter. There's definitely something off with the inventory. Over the past 3 weeks, the twins had noticed more concerning patterns in their business. Products vanished without record of being sold. Spell components went missing. Twice now, they'd found the back door unlocked in the morning, though nothing appeared to be stolen. Maybe we should set up some additional security charms, George suggested, pushing aside the wedding catalogs to make room for the ledgers. Already did, Fred said, dropping into a chair. After that shipment of shield hats disappeared last week. Didn't catch anything though. Angelina studied their worried faces. Have you reported this to the Auror office? Harry would help. And say what? George asked. That someone might be breaking into our joke shop to steal trick wands and skiving snack boxes. They've got bigger problems to deal with. Besides, Fred added, business is good enough that we can absorb the losses. It's just, strange. The fireplace suddenly flared green, and Ginny's head appeared in the flames. There you all are, she exclaimed. Mum's been trying to reach you. The caterer needs to know about the menu changes by tomorrow, and she's in a state about the flowers. Fred groaned. Tell her we'll be there for dinner, and Angelina will sort it out then. After Ginny's head disappeared, Fred turned to Angelina. Sorry about all this. Didn't realize getting married would involve so many decisions about napkin colors and chair covers. Angelina laughed, leaning over to kiss him quickly. Your mother means well. And honestly, I'd marry you in the back room of the shop wearing Quidditch robes if that's what it took. Don't tempt me, Fred warned with a grin. George, you coming to dinner? George hesitated, glancing at the ledgers. Think I'll stay and try to sort this out. Tell Mum I'll make it up to her. Fred looked like he wanted to argue but was interrupted by a loud crash from downstairs. The three of them jumped to their feet, wands drawn, and raced down to the shop floor. A display of Wonder Witch products had been knocked over, cosmetics spilled across the floor. Standing amid the mess was a small, scruffy owl, a letter tied to its leg. Bloody bird, George muttered, lowering his wand. Came in through the window, I guess. Fred approached cautiously and untied the letter. As soon as he did, the owl took off, soaring back out the open window. No return address, Fred noted, turning the envelope over. It was addressed simply to the Weasley twins. He broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. His face darkened as he read. What is it? Angelina asked, moving to his side. Fred handed her the letter wordlessly. In crude, block letters, it read, Blood traitors beware. The Dark Lord's followers remember those who opposed him. Your family will pay for your betrayal. The dead will rise again. Charming, George said grimly, reading over Angelina's shoulder. "Looks like we've graduated from petty theft to death threats." "This isn't a joke anymore," Angelina said firmly. "You need to tell Harry. This could be connected to those break-ins." Fred nodded slowly, his usual humor completely absent. "I'll go tonight after dinner." "You're right, this is more than just mischief." "I'll keep looking through the security logs," George offered. "See if there's anything we missed." As Angelina helped Fred clean up the spilled products, George examined the letter more closely. Something about the phrasing bothered him. "The dead will rise again" seemed like an odd threat, even for a Death Eater sympathizer. Later that night, after Fred and Angelina had left for the burrow, George remained in the shop, reviewing security measures and examining their inventory records. He was so absorbed in his task that he nearly missed the slight shimmer of movement near the back door. Drawing his wand, George moved silently across the shop floor, ears straining for any sound. There, a soft scraping, like someone trying to pick a lock. "Hominum revelio," he whispered, and felt the spell confirm a human presence on the other side of the door. Making a split-second decision, George disillusioned himself with a tap of his wand and positioned himself beside the door, ready to ambush whoever entered. The lock clicked softly, and the door eased open. A cloaked figure slipped inside, moving with practiced stealth toward the storeroom where they kept their most valuable ingredients and experimental products. George waited until the intruder had passed him before canceling his disillusionment charm and pointing his wand at the stranger's back. "Petrificus totalis." The figure stiffened and toppled forward with a thud. George flicked his wand to turn on the lights and approached cautiously, using his foot to roll the frozen intruder onto their back. The man's face was unfamiliar, middle-aged, with a thin scar running from his right eye to his jaw, and cold, hate-filled eyes that glared up at George. "Well, well," George said conversationally, crouching down to search the man's pockets. "Fancy meeting you here after hours. I'm afraid we're closed, but I'd be happy to help you find something during regular business hours." He found a wand, which he pocketed, and a scrap of parchment with a list of ingredients, the same ones that had been going missing. "Interesting shopping list you have here. Planning to make something nasty, I imagine." George stood up, considering his options. "I should call the Aurors, but something tells me you're just the errand boy. So how about we have a chat instead?" George cast another spell to bind the man with ropes, then released the body-binding curse. The intruder immediately began struggling and shouting. "I'd keep it down if I were you," George advised, twirling his wand casually. "The only people who'll hear you are the ones living above Fortescue's across the street, and old man Fortescue is deaf as a post." "You'll regret this, blood traitor," the man spat. "The Dark Lord's work isn't finished. His loyal servants remain." Yes, very scary," George replied, unimpressed. "Mind telling me why you've been stealing from my shop? Planning a particularly evil prank?" The man's face contorted with rage. "We're preparing a welcome for your brother's wedding. A special reunion, you might say." A chill ran down George's spine, but he kept his expression neutral. "And who's we, exactly? You and what army? In case you haven't noticed, your side lost." "We are the remnant," the intruder hissed. "We who remained faithful when others claimed to be under the Imperius curse. We who kept the old ways when others betrayed their blood." "Fascinating," George drawled, though his mind was racing. "And what exactly do you plan to do at my brother's wedding? Spike the punch? Release a bunch of Cornish pixies during the vows?" The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You'll see. Or rather, you won't. You'll be too busy attending a different sort of family reunion." Before George could question him further, the man twisted violently in his bindings and bit down hard on something hidden in his mouth. Immediately, his eyes rolled back, and he began to convulse. Bloody hell! George rushed forward, trying to force the man's mouth open, but it was too late. Foam bubbled at his lips, and within seconds, he lay still. George checked for a pulse, finding none. Suicide capsule, he muttered grimly. Definitely more serious than I thought. He stood up, running a hand through his hair as he considered his next move. This was no longer just about break-ins and threats, someone was actively planning to attack Fred and Angelina's wedding. But the intruder's words about a different sort of family reunion suggested there might be multiple targets. With a wave of his wand, George sent a Patronus message to Harry Potter, requesting immediate assistance. Then he searched the dead man's pockets more thoroughly, finding a small key with the number 713 engraved on it. By the time Harry arrived with Ron and 2 other Aurors, George had compiled everything he knew about the break-ins, the threatening letter, and the man's cryptic warnings. He called them the Remnant, George explained as Harry examined the body. Said they were planning something for Fred's wedding, but also mentioned something else, a different sort of family reunion, that would keep me busy. Harry frowned, pocketing the key George had found. We've heard whispers about a group calling themselves the Remnant. Former Death Eaters who escaped prosecution, mostly low-ranking followers who've been causing trouble here and there. Nothing this organized, though. The wedding's in 3 weeks, George said, worry evident in his voice. Should we postpone it? Let's not panic yet, Harry advised, though his expression was serious. We'll increase security, put Aurors on duty. This key might lead us somewhere useful. It looks like a Gringotts vault key. Ron, who had been examining the list of stolen ingredients, looked up with a grim expression. George, these aren't for making weapons or poisons. This looks like a list for a very specific potion, one that requires something personal from the target. What kind of potion? George asked, a sense of dread building in his stomach. Can't be sure without checking, but several of these are used in identity potions, more complex than polyjuice. Some are used in soul magic. Ron had become surprisingly knowledgeable about such things during his aura training. Soul magic? George repeated, alarmed. You don't think, I don't know, Ron admitted. But whatever they're planning, it's not good. Harry instructed the other Aurors to take the body to the Ministry for identification, then turned back to George. We'll need to tell Fred about this. No, George said firmly, surprising both Harry and Ron. Not yet. George, mate, he needs to know, Ron protested. It's his wedding they're targeting. And if we tell him now, he'll either want to cancel the wedding, which would devastate Angelina and Mum, or he'll be so focused on protecting everyone that he won't enjoy his own wedding, George reasoned. Give me a few days to investigate. If we can't make progress, then we'll tell him. Harry hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. 3 days. If we don't have more information by then, we tell Fred everything. Deal, George agreed, already forming a plan. Ron, can you check those ingredients against the potion references in the Aura Library? I want to know exactly what they're trying to brew. On it, Ron promised. What will you do? George picked up the scrap of parchment with the list. I'm going to find out where our friend was taking these ingredients. Someone's giving the orders, and I intend to find out who. After Harry and Ron left, taking the body with them, George locked up the shop and returned to the flat. He pulled out a map of Wizarding Britain and began marking locations of reported Death Eater sympathizer activity in the past year. A pattern was forming, centered around several properties once owned by old pure-blood families. One in particular caught his eye, an old Rosier estate in the West Country, not far from the borough. Family reunion, George murmured, remembering the intruder's words. It suddenly clicked, the Weasley family clock, their most personal magical object, connecting all family members. If someone wanted to target the entire Weasley clan at once, he needed to warn his family, but first, he needed proof. The wedding was 3 weeks away, but George had a sinking feeling that time was running out much faster than that. Fred noticed George's increasing distraction over the following days but attributed it to wedding preparations and their ongoing inventory issues. Between meeting with suppliers, finalizing the guest list with Angelina, and developing new products for the summer season, Fred barely had time to breathe, let alone interrogate his twin about his odd behavior. It wasn't until a week before the wedding that Fred confronted George directly. He'd returned to the shop after a final fitting for his dress robes to find George huddled in the back office with Percy, of all people, surrounded by stacks of parchment and ancient-looking books. "Since when do you two conspire together?" Fred asked, leaning against the doorframe with a raised eyebrow. "Last I checked, Percy's idea of fun was reorganizing cauldron thickness reports." Percy and George jumped, clearly startled by Fred's arrival. George hastily shuffled the papers into a messy stack while Percy adjusted his glasses nervously. "Just going over some, tax considerations for the business," Percy said stiffly. "Expansion to international markets involves complex regulatory compliance." Fred's eyes narrowed. Percy had always been a terrible liar. "Right. And that explains why you're reading." He craned his neck to see the title of the book Percy was trying to hide, Ancient Blood Rituals and Their Modern Applications. George sighed, exchanging a look with Percy. "All right, you caught us. We're planning your stag night, and it involves complex ritualistic magic to enhance the fire whiskey." "George," Fred said, his voice unusually serious, "what's going on? You've been avoiding me for days, sneaking off with Harry and Ron, and now Percy's involved." "If there's a problem with the shop, it's not the shop," George interrupted, running a hand through his hair. "Look, there have been some threats, nothing concrete, but Harry thought it best to increase security for the wedding." "Threats?" Fred repeated, moving fully into the room. "What kind of threats?" Percy cleared his throat. "After that letter you received, George contacted Harry. There's been intelligence suggesting a group of Death Eater sympathizers might be planning something. We're just taking precautions." Fred looked between them, his expression hardening. "And you didn't think I should know about this?" "We didn't want to worry you," George replied, not quite meeting his twin's eyes. "You've got enough on your plate with the wedding." "It's my wedding," Fred pointed out, his voice rising slightly. "If someone's threatening it, I should be the first to know." "Fred," George began, but Fred cut him off. "No, I get it. You think I can't handle it, that I'll fall apart at the first sign of danger because of what happened during the battle." Fred's hand unconsciously traced the scar on his face. "I'm not made of glass, George. I didn't die that day." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. George flinched as if he'd been struck. "I know that," he said quietly. "Better than anyone." Percy cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps I should leave you two to." "No, stay," Fred insisted. "I want to know exactly what's going on. All of it." George hesitated, then nodded resignedly. "Fine. Sit down, this might take a while." Over the next hour, George and Percy filled Fred in on everything they discovered, the break-ins at the shop, the dead intruder, the mysterious group calling themselves the Remnant, and their suspicions about an attack planned not just for the wedding but potentially targeting the entire Weasley family. "The ingredients they've been stealing," George explained, showing Fred the list, "they're components for a complex potion called Anima Vinculum. It's ancient magic, designed to create a bond between an object and a person's life force." "Like a Horcrux?" Fred asked, alarmed. "No, not that dark," Percy clarified. "More like an enchanted object that can influence those connected to it. We think they're targeting the Weasley family clock." Fred stared at them. "The clock? What could they possibly do with that?" "Control it," George said grimly. "Or worse, reverse its function. Instead of showing where family members are, it could be used to send them places, or harm them from a distance." That's mental," Fred said, shaking his head. "Even if that's possible, why go to all this trouble? Why not just attack us directly?" "Because they're cowards," Percy said with uncharacteristic venom. "They don't have the numbers for a frontal assault like they did during the war. This way, They can strike at the entire family at once, from safety. Fred stood up and began pacing the small office. So what's the plan? Cancel the wedding? Hide the clock? No, George replied firmly. The wedding goes ahead as planned, with additional security. Harry's assigned Aurors to patrol discreetly. As for the clock. He hesitated, exchanging a glance with Percy. What? Fred demanded. I need to find their base of operations, George said. We've narrowed it down to a few locations, but I need to check them personally. The Aurors can't act without more evidence. I'm coming with you, Fred said immediately. George shook his head. You can't. You need to be visible, going about your normal routine. If they suspect we're onto them, they might accelerate their plans. So I'm supposed to just carry on with wedding preparations while you put yourself in danger? Fred asked incredulously. Yes, George said simply. Trust me on this, Fred. I've got a plan. Fred studied his twin's face for a long moment. Despite their identical features, he could see something different in George's eyes, a determination and seriousness that wasn't usually there. When? Fred asked finally. Tomorrow night, George answered. Percy's been tracking owl movements from known sympathizers. There's a gathering planned at an old Rosier property in Devon. Fred nodded slowly. Fine. But you're taking backup, not just Percy, no offense. None taken, Percy said mildly. Harry's sending Ron and another Auror to meet us there, George assured him. We're just doing reconnaissance, not storming the castle. And you'll be back in time for the rehearsal dinner the day after tomorrow? Fred pressed. George grinned, some of his usual mischief returning. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Someone needs to make sure the champagne is properly hexed to turn the drinker's hair the same color as their emotions. You will do no such thing, Percy said sternly, though his lips twitched slightly. Angelina would hex you into next week. As the tension in the room dissipated, Fred found himself studying his brother thoughtfully. It was strange to see George taking the lead like this, handling a serious threat while Fred focused on the wedding. Usually, it was Fred who leaped into action first, with George following his lead. All right, Fred said finally. But I want regular updates, and if anything seems off, you abort the mission and come straight back. Deal? Deal, George agreed, relief evident in his face. Now, unless you want to help us go through these dusty old books on clock magic, you should probably get back to Angelina. Doesn't she have the final menu tasting today? Fred checked his watch and swore. Bloody hell, I'm late. She's going to kill me. As he rushed toward the door, Fred paused and looked back at his twin. George. Be careful tomorrow. George winked. Always am. Besides, I've already lost an ear, can't afford to lose anything else or I'll be even less handsome than you. With a reluctant laugh, Fred left, his mind racing with everything he'd just learned. As he hurried through Diagon Alley toward the leaky cauldron where he was supposed to meet Angelina, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting between him and George, something that had begun the moment he'd decided to propose to Angelina, and was accelerating with every passing day. The next evening, George stood in the shadow of a large oak tree, his disillusionment charm providing additional cover as he surveyed the dilapidated Rosier estate. Beside him, Percy adjusted his glasses, peering through specialized omnioculars that could detect magical signatures. There are at least a dozen people inside, Percy murmured. The main wards are focused on the east wing, that's likely where they're keeping any important materials. Or where they're brewing the potion, George added, checking his watch. Ron and the other Auror should be at the south entrance by now. They had spent the afternoon carefully mapping the estate's boundaries and identifying its protective enchantments. The property had fallen into disrepair after the First Wizarding War, when the main branch of the Rosier family had been either killed or imprisoned. According to Percy's research, it had recently been inherited by a distant cousin, Isla Rosier, who worked as a minor clerk in the Department of Magical Transportation. Isla Rosier is the key, Percy had explained earlier that day. She has access to FLU network regulations, port key authorizations, all the transportation magic that could be used to affect the clock's function. Now, as they prepared to infiltrate the estate, George felt a rare twinge of genuine fear. Not for himself, but for what might happen if they failed. The wedding was just days away, and somewhere in that building, people were plotting to harm his family. "Ready?" George asked, gripping his wand tightly. Percy nodded, his usual pomposity replaced by grim determination. "Remember, we're just gathering intelligence. If we can confirm their plans and identify the key members, the Aurors can make arrests before the wedding." "Right," George agreed, though a part of him wanted nothing more than to storm the building and end the threat immediately. They moved silently across the overgrown grounds, using a detection spell to avoid triggering any magical traps. As they neared a partially collapsed wall that offered access to the east wing, a silver terrier Patronus bounded up to them, Ron's message that he and Auror Proudfoot were in position. George sent back his own Patronus with confirmation, then turned to Percy. "I'll go in first. Cover me." Before Percy could protest, George had slipped through the gap in the wall, entering a dark, musty corridor lined with faded portraits of stern-looking wizards and witches, the Rosier ancestors, watching disapprovingly as he crept past. Following the sound of voices, George made his way deeper into the house, staying close to the walls and keeping his disillusionment charm active. The voices grew louder as he approached what appeared to be a former ballroom, now converted into a meeting space. Through a crack in the double doors, George could see about 15 people gathered around a long table. At the head stood a tall, severe-looking woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was speaking in a cold, precise voice that carried clearly to George's hiding place. "The preparations are nearly complete," she was saying. "Knot has confirmed that the final components will be delivered tomorrow. The potion will be ready for the wedding day." "And you're certain it will work, Isla?" asked a wiry man with a nervous tick in his left eye. "The Weasleys are blood traitors, but they're powerful witches and wizards. If this fails, it will not fail," Isla Rosier cut him off sharply. "The anima vinculum potion is infallible when brewed correctly, and we have taken every precaution. The clock is the perfect conduit, it already contains powerful magic connecting each family member." George felt his blood run cold. They were definitely targeting the family clock. "What about security at the wedding?" another voice asked, a younger wizard George couldn't see clearly. "Potter will have Aurors everywhere." Isla smiled thinly. "That's why we won't be attacking the wedding directly. The beauty of this plan is that we don't need to be anywhere near the burrow when it happens. Once the potion is introduced to the clock, it will affect every Weasley simultaneously, regardless of where they are." "And what exactly will it do to them?" the nervous man pressed. "It will create a reunion, of sorts," Isla replied with a chilling smile. "Each Weasley will be confronted by someone they've lost, someone whose death they're responsible for. The magic will feed on their guilt, their grief, their fear, until it consumes them entirely." George felt sick. He thought of his father confronted by the Muggleborns who had died during the war, of his mother facing Fred's would-be killers, of Ron seeing Lavender Brown or Colin Creevey. "But the best part," Isla continued, her voice dropping to a malicious whisper that George had to strain to hear, "is what we have planned for the twins. One survived when he should have died. The other lives with survivor's guilt, even though his twin still breathes. Imagine their horror when they're forced to live out what should have happened, when Fred Weasley finally meets the death he cheated 5 years ago." The room erupted in cruel laughter, and George felt rage boil up inside him. He wanted nothing more than to burst through those doors and hex every last one of them into oblivion. Only years of practiced self-control kept him in place, listening as they continued to outline their plans. "Tomorrow night, Corvus will infiltrate the burrow during their rehearsal dinner," Isla instructed. "Everyone will be distracted, and our source confirms the clock has been moved to the shed to make room for wedding preparations. The potion must be applied directly to the clock's mechanism. And the activation, asked a burly wizard near the back of the room. Will occur during the wedding ceremony itself, Isla replied. The emotional peak of the day, when magic is already heightened by celebration. The potion will draw power from those emotions, making the manifestations even stronger. George had heard enough. Carefully, he backed away from the door and retraced his steps to the collapsed wall where Percy was waiting anxiously. What did you find out? Percy whispered as soon as George reappeared. It's worse than we thought, George replied grimly. They're planning to poison the clock tomorrow night during the rehearsal dinner. We need to warn the others and set a trap. As they made their way back to the meeting point where Ron and Proudfoot were waiting, George outlined what he'd overheard. Ron's face grew increasingly pale. Bloody hell, he swore when George finished. They're going to use the clock to kill Fred. And the rest of us? Not if we stop them first, George said firmly. We know when and how they're planning to do it. We can be ready. We should tell Harry immediately, Proudfoot insisted. With what you've heard, we have enough to raid the place right now. George shook his head. No. If we raid now, some of them might escape. We need to catch Corvus in the act tomorrow night, then round up the rest of them. George is right, Percy agreed, surprising everyone. Strategic patience is called for. If we move too soon, we risk missing some of the conspirators. Ron looked between his brothers, conflict evident on his face. What about Fred? He needs to know. George hesitated. I'll tell him. But not everything. Not the part about them targeting him specifically. He's been through enough. As they apparat back to the ministry to report their findings to Harry, George couldn't shake the cold dread that had settled in his stomach. Despite all their preparations, despite knowing the plan, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was going to go terribly wrong. The morning of the rehearsal dinner dawned bright and clear. Fred woke early, excitement and nervousness warring in his stomach as he realized he was getting married the next day. Beside him, Angelina slept peacefully, her dark hair spread across the pillow. Fred smiled, reaching out to brush a strand from her face. She stirred but didn't wake. Quietly, Fred slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen to make tea. He and Angelina had moved into a small cottage near Ottery St. Catchpole 3 months earlier, close enough to the borough for regular family visits but with enough distance for privacy. As the kettle boiled, Fred found himself thinking about George. His twin had returned late the previous night, sending only a brief Patronus message saying, "All well, details tomorrow." Fred had waited up for a while, hoping George might stop by, but eventually Angelina had convinced him to come to bed. He'll be fine, she had assured him. George knows what he's doing. Still, Fred couldn't shake his worry. It felt wrong, somehow, to be preparing for the happiest day of his life while George was facing danger. Throughout their lives, they had always faced challenges together, even during the Battle of Hogwarts, they had been fighting side by side when the wall had exploded, nearly killing Fred. The memory still haunted him occasionally. If Percy hadn't pushed him aside at the last second, if the rubble had fallen just slightly differently. Fred knew he had been incredibly lucky. The scar on his face was a small price to pay for surviving when so many others hadn't. The kettle whistled, pulling Fred from his thoughts. As he poured the hot water into a mug, a sharp crack outside announced someone apparating onto their front step. Moments later, there was a familiar pattern of knocks at the door, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones, the twins' signal since childhood. Fred hurried to open the door, finding George standing there looking tired but triumphant. "Morning, future ball and chain victim," George greeted him cheerfully. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything indecent." "Just making tea," Fred replied, stepping aside to let his brother in. "Want some? You look like you could use it." "God, yes." George collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, rubbing his eyes. "Been up all night with Harry and the Aurors, planning for tonight. Fred handed him a steaming mug and sat opposite him. So, what happened yesterday? Did you find them? George took a long sip before answering. We did. You were right about the Rosier estate. They're definitely planning something for the wedding, but we're going to stop them before they get the chance. How? Fred asked, leaning forward intently. They're going to try to sabotage the family clock tonight during the rehearsal dinner, George explained, carefully omitting the details about their specific plans for Fred. Someone called Corvus Blackwood is supposed to sneak into the shed while everyone's distracted. And you're going to let him? Fred asked incredulously. George grinned. Well, we're going to let him think he succeeded. Harry's replaced the clock with a fake. When Blackwood applies the potion, he'll trigger a tracking charm that will lead us straight back to the rest of the group. Brilliant, Fred acknowledged, though he still looked concerned. But what if something goes wrong? What if he realizes it's a trap? That's why I need you to act completely normal tonight, George stressed. The rehearsal needs to be convincing. You, Angelina, all the guests, everyone needs to be focused on the wedding as if nothing's wrong. Fred nodded slowly. I can do that. But I want to be there when you confront them. Fred, no, George. I'm not sitting this one out. They threatened my wedding, our family. I deserve to be there. George studied his twin's determined expression and sighed. Fine. After Blackwood takes the bait, I'll send you a signal. Make some excuse to Angelina and meet me at the apparition point beyond the orchard. Deal, Fred agreed, just as Angelina's voice called from the bedroom. Fred? Who are you talking to? Just George, Fred called back. Want some tea, love? Yes, please, she replied, and they heard the sounds of her getting up. George lowered his voice. Remember, not a word to Angelina about any of this. The fewer people who know, the better. Fred looked uncomfortable but nodded. Just until tonight. After it's over, no more secrets. No more secrets, George agreed, forcing a smile as Angelina entered the kitchen in her dressing gown. Morning, George, she greeted him with a kiss on the cheek. You're here early. Nervous about your best man speech tomorrow? Terrified, George replied with an exaggerated grimace. Still trying to decide which of Fred's embarrassing childhood stories to share. So many options, so little time. As the conversation shifted to wedding preparations, George caught Fred's eye over Angelina's head. A silent understanding passed between them, whatever happened tonight, they would face it together, as they always had. But for the first time in their lives, George found himself hoping that Fred wouldn't be by his side when he confronted the danger. The thought of losing his twin, again, was too much to bear. The burrow was transformed for the rehearsal dinner. Fairy lights twinkled in the garden, tables covered in white linen dotted the lawn, and enchanted lanterns floated gently above the guests' heads. Molly had outdone herself with the food, serving course after course of delicious dishes while Arthur kept everyone's glasses filled with elf-made wine and fire whiskey. Fred and Angelina sat at the head table, surrounded by their wedding party. George was beside Fred, participating in the conversations and offering toasts, but his eyes constantly scanned the perimeter of the garden, checking in with the disguised Auror station strategically around the property. Harry and Ron were there ostensibly as guests, but both had their wands easily accessible. Even Percy had a role to play, engaging Minister Shacklebolt in a loud, detailed conversation about cauldron regulations, a perfect distraction for anyone trying to eavesdrop on security measures. As the evening progressed, George caught Fred's eye and nodded slightly toward the shed where the fake family clock had been placed. Fred gave an almost imperceptible nod in return, then turned to whisper something in Angelina's ear that made her laugh. George slipped away from the table, making his way casually toward the house as if heading to the bathroom. Once out of sight, he disillusioned himself and moved quickly to his position near the shed. Harry was already there, similarly concealed. Any sign of him? George whispered. Not yet, Harry murmured back. But the wards detected someone approaching from the south a few minutes ago. He's being careful. They waited in tense silence, the sounds of laughter and conversation from the party drifting across the garden. After what seemed like an eternity, George spotted a slight distortion in the air, someone under a disillusionment charm, moving slowly toward the shed. Harry tensed beside him, wand at the ready. They had agreed not to act until Blackwood had actually applied the potion to the clock. They needed evidence of the attempted sabotage for the charges to stick. The shed door opened silently, and the distortion disappeared inside. George and Harry gave him 30 seconds, then followed, moving with practiced stealth. Inside the dimly lit shed, they could see the disillusionment charm fading as Blackwood focused on his task. He was a tall, thin man with a hawk-like face and cold eyes, carefully examining the family clock that stood in the corner. From their hiding place behind Arthur's workbench, George and Harry watched as Blackwood removed a small vial from his robes. The liquid inside was a sickly greenish-black, seeming to absorb rather than reflect the minimal light in the shed. Blackwood uncorked the vial and began to mutter an incantation, tracing his wand around the face of the clock. The potion rose from the vial, suspended in the air, then began to seep into the clock's mechanism, disappearing into the golden surface. "Now," Harry whispered, and both of them stood, wands pointed directly at Blackwood. Petrificus totalis, they cast in unison. Blackwood's body went rigid, the empty vial dropping from his paralyzed fingers and shattering on the floor. Harry quickly bound him with magical ropes while George cast additional anti-apparition wards around the shed. "Corvus Blackwood," Harry said coldly, removing the body bind just enough to allow the man to speak. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted use of dark magic, and threatening a wizarding family." Blackwood's eyes darted between them, calculating. "You've got nothing on me, Potter. I was just admiring the clock." "Save it," George snapped. "We know all about the remnant, the anima vinculum potion, and your plans for the wedding tomorrow." Something flickered across Blackwood's face, surprise, quickly masked. "If you know so much, why haven't you arrested the others? Why the trap?" "That's exactly what we're about to do," Harry replied. "The tracking charm in that fake clock is already leading Aurors to your headquarters as we speak." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "You think you're clever, don't you? But you've miscalculated, blood traitor," he said, looking directly at George. The clock was never the only target. George felt a cold dread sweep through him. "What are you talking about?" "Ask yourself," Blackwood sneered, "if I'm here, where's Isla Rosier? Where's Thaddeus Knott? Did you really think we'd put all our eggs in one basket?" Before either George or Harry could respond, a silver terrier Patronus, Ron's, burst through the wall of the shed. "Harry!" Ron's voice came urgently from the Patronus. "The Rosier estate is empty. They've cleared out, looks like they left hours ago. Something's wrong." Harry swore, turning back to Blackwood, who was now smiling coldly. "What have you done?" George demanded, grabbing the front of Blackwood's robes. "Where are the others?" "Exactly where they need to be," Blackwood replied with calm satisfaction. "The remnant has many supporters, Weasley. Did you check all the waiters serving your party tonight? All the delivery people who brought supplies today?" George released him as if burned, turning to Harry with horror. The party, they both ran for the door, leaving Blackwood bound and secured with additional spells. As they burst back into the garden, George frantically scanned the crowd for any sign of trouble. Everything looked normal, guests laughing, eating, drinking. Fred was still at the head table, arm around Angelina, raising a toast to his future in-laws. Nothing seemed amiss. "I don't see anything," Harry muttered, wand still drawn but held close to his side to avoid alarming the guests. "Spread out," George instructed. "I'll check the house, you take the perimeter. And find Ron, we need to know exactly what he found at the Rosier place." As Harry moved away, George spotted one of the waiters, a young woman he didn't recognize, carrying a tray of champagne flutes toward the head table. There was something odd about her movements, something too precise and focused. "Wait," George called to Harry, but he was already too far away to hear over the music and conversation. George began pushing through the crowd, trying to reach the head table before the waitress. But he was too far away, too many people between them. He watched in growing horror as she approached Fred and Angelina, offering them champagne from her tray. Fred took 2 glasses, handing one to Angelina with a smile. "Fred!" George shouted, no longer caring about maintaining cover. "Don't drink that." His voice was lost in the general noise. Fred raised his glass, clinking it against Angelina's, and both of them took a sip. George finally broke through the crowd, lunging forward and knocking the glasses from their hands. Champagne splashed across the white tablecloth as the glasses shattered on the ground. "George!" Angelina exclaimed, jumping to her feet. "What are you doing?" Fred stared at his twin in confusion, but George was already turning to grab the waitress. She backed away, her face transforming from pleasant servility to cold hatred. "Too late," she hissed, and before George could reach her, she disapparated with a crack, breaking through the anti-apparition wards with shocking ease. "How did she?" George began, then spun back to Fred, who was now standing, looking concerned but unharmed. "What's going on?" Fred demanded. "George, you're scaring everyone." George grabbed his brother's shoulders, examining him frantically. "Did you swallow any of that champagne? Either of you?" "Just a sip," Angelina said, looking bewildered. "George, what?" Her words were cut off as Fred suddenly staggered, his face draining of color. He clutched at his throat, gasping for air. "Fred!" George and Angelina cried simultaneously, catching him as his knees buckled. Around them, chaos erupted. Guests jumped to their feet, voices raised in alarm. Harry and Ron pushed through the crowd, wands drawn. "What happened?" Harry demanded, kneeling beside Fred, who was now trembling violently, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Poison," George said tersely. "The champagne. That waitress was one of them." Angelina looked confused. "But I had some too, and I feel fine." "It wasn't meant for you," George realized with a sickening clarity. It was specifically targeted for Fred. Molly had arrived, her face white with fear. "Someone call a healer." "Arthur, where's the Bezoar?" Arthur was already running toward the house, while Bill and Charlie cleared space around Fred, who was now lying on the ground, his eyes unfocused. George knelt beside him, gripping his hand tightly. "Stay with me, Freddie," he urged, his voice breaking. "Dad's getting help. You're going to be fine." Fred's eyes found George's, confusion and fear evident in them. "Not how I planned to spend my last night, as a bachelor," he gasped, attempting a weak smile. "Shut up, you prat," George said fiercely. "Save your strength." Arthur returned, a small, shriveled bezoar in his hand. With Angelina's help, they managed to get Fred to swallow it. For a moment, his breathing seemed to ease, but then he convulsed again, more violently than before. "It's not working," Angelina cried, tears streaming down her face. "Why isn't it working?" "Because it's not a standard poison," came a new voice. Hermione pushed through the circle of onlookers, her expression grim but focused. "It's part of the anima vinculum potion, isn't it, George?" George looked up at her in surprise. "How did you?" "I helped Ron research it," she explained quickly, kneeling opposite him beside Fred. "A bezoar won't work. The potion doesn't kill directly, it separates spirit from body, forcing the victim to confront their worst fears and memories until the shock kills them." "How do we stop it?" Angelina demanded. Hermione hesitated. I'm not sure it can be stopped once it's begun. But maybe slowed down, contained until we can find a counter-curse." "St. Mungo's," Molly insisted. "They'll know what to do." "No time," George said, making a split-second decision. "I know where we need to go." Harry, can you create a portkey? Harry nodded grimly, grabbing a napkin from the table and tapping it with his wand. Portus, he muttered, and the napkin glowed blue briefly. Where are you taking him? Angelina asked, her voice steadier now despite her tear-stained face. The Rosier estate, George answered, gathering Fred in his arms. The antidote has to be there. They wouldn't use a poison this complex without having protection for themselves. I'm coming with you, Angelina insisted. George shook his head. Too dangerous. Harry, Ron, and I will go. Hermione, can you work with Bill to contain the magic here? Try to find a countercurse in case we fail. Hermione nodded, already pulling Bill aside and speaking rapidly about curse-breaking techniques. You can't shut me out of this, Angelina argued, gripping George's arm tightly. He's going to be my husband tomorrow. George looked at her determined face and relented. Fine. But you stay behind us, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? She nodded firmly, moving to take Fred's other arm. Fred himself was barely conscious now, his skin waxy and pale, his breathing labored. Everyone ready? Harry asked, holding out the portkey napkin. On 3. 1, 2, 3, they all touched the napkin, and George felt the familiar jerk behind his navel as the portkey activated. The world spun around them in a blur of color, and then they were landing hard on damp grass, the dark silhouette of the Rosier estate looming before them in the moonlight. Wands out, Harry instructed unnecessarily, as everyone except George already had theirs drawn. George was still supporting Fred, who had lost consciousness during the journey. Where would they keep an antidote? Ron asked, scanning the area for any signs of movement. East Wing, George replied grimly. That's where they were brewing the potion. If there's an antidote, it'll be there. They moved quickly but cautiously toward the house, Angelina helping George with Fred while Harry and Ron took point, casting detection spells as they went. No wards, Harry reported with a frown. They really did clear out. Or they're waiting for us, George countered. Stay alert. They entered through the same collapsed wall George had used during his reconnaissance, making their way through dark corridors toward the ballroom where the remnant had gathered. The house was eerily silent, dust motes dancing in the beams of light from their wands. This is too easy, Ron muttered as they approached the ballroom doors. I don't like it. Harry pushed the doors open carefully, revealing the large room beyond. It was empty of people, but tables lined the walls, covered with cauldrons, ingredients, and vials of various potions. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface swirling with mist rather than reflecting the room. What is that? Angelina whispered, staring at the mirror. I don't know, George replied. But help me with Fred first. We need to find the antidote. They laid Fred on a cleared table, his breathing now so shallow it was barely visible. His skin had taken on a grayish tinge, and occasionally his body would twitch, as if fighting some unseen force. Ron and Harry began searching through the potions and notes scattered around the room, while Angelina stayed by Fred's side, holding his hand and whispering reassurances. George was examining a rack of vials near what appeared to be the main workstation when he found a small crystal bottle containing a silvery liquid. A label in elegant script read simply, Anima Vinculum, Antidote. I found it, he called, relief flooding through him as he hurried back to Fred's side. But as he reached his twin, a cold voice spoke from the shadows near the mirror. I wouldn't use that if I were you, Mr. Weasley. They all spun around, wands raised, to see Isla Rosier emerge from behind the strange mirror. She was exactly as George remembered from his spying, tall, austere, with steel-gray hair and cold eyes. The antidote is quite specific, she continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. It will indeed save your brother from the potion's effects, but at a price. Magic always demands balance, you see. What price? George demanded, the vial clutched tightly in his hand. Isla smiled thinly. The potion was designed to force Fred Weasley to face death, the death he should have experienced 5 years ago. The antidote transfers that fate to another. To who? Angelina asked, her voice shaking. To whoever administers it, of course, Isla replied simply. A life for a life. That's the balance. George looked down at the vial in his hand, then at Fred's pale, still face. Without hesitation, he uncorked it. George, no. Harry shouted, stepping forward. She could be lying. I'm not, Isla said calmly. But by all means, test my theory. Your brother has perhaps 5 minutes before the separation is permanent. Then not even the antidote will save him. Why are you doing this? Angelina demanded, tears streaming down her face. Why Fred? Why our wedding? It was never about the wedding, dear, Isla explained, her voice taking on a lecturing tone. It was about justice. Balance. The Weasleys fought against the Dark Lord, helped bring down the natural order. For that, they must pay. Fred Weasley should have died when that wall exploded. We're simply correcting an oversight. And the mirror? George asked, nodding toward the strange object behind her. What's that for? Insurance, Isla replied with a cold smile. And a way to witness the results of our work. It shows the spirit realm, the place between life and death. Your brother's spirit is already halfway there. She gestured toward the mirror, where the mist had begun to form a shape, a figure that looked disturbingly like Fred. George made his decision. Harry, Ron, get her. Angelina, help me with Fred. As Harry and Ron advanced on Isla, who raised her wand in defense, George tilted Fred's head back and poured the silvery antidote into his mouth. Then he waited, watching anxiously for any sign of change. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Fred's body arched upward, a silver glow emanating from his skin. At the same time, George felt a cold sensation spreading through his own veins, as if his blood were turning to ice. George! Angelina cried, looking between him and Fred in horror. George could only shake his head, unable to speak as the cold intensified. He distantly heard spells being cast, Harry and Ron dueling with Isla, but his focus remained on Fred, whose color was slowly returning. Fred's eyes flew open, and he gasped, drawing in a deep, desperate breath. At the same moment, George felt his knees buckle, darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. Fred, he managed to whisper before collapsing to the floor. The last thing he heard was Fred calling his name, panic evident in his voice. Then darkness claimed him completely. George floated in a space between worlds. Around him swirled mist and shadows, occasionally forming into half-recognized shapes before dissolving again. He felt weightless, disconnected from his body, yet somehow more aware than he had ever been in life. Was this death? It wasn't what he had expected. There was no pain, no fear, just a profound sense of in-betweenness, as if he were waiting for something. Gradually, the mist before him solidified into the shape of the mirror he had seen in the Rosier ballroom. Through it, as if watching through a window, he could see the scene he had left behind, Fred kneeling beside his motionless body, Angelina trying to revive him with spells, Harry and Ron subduing Isla Rosier, who was laughing despite being bound in magical ropes. George! Fred was shouting, shaking his twin's lifeless form. Don't you dare do this. Don't you dare leave me. George tried to call out, to reach through the mirror somehow, but his voice made no sound, and his form had no substance in this strange realm. He can't hear you, said a gentle voice behind him. George turned, or rather, his consciousness shifted, to find a familiar figure standing, if standing was the right word in this place, nearby. Remus Lupin looked exactly as George remembered him, though perhaps less careworn, the gray in his hair less pronounced, the lines of worry absent from his face. Professor Lupin? George asked, surprised to find his voice working now that he was addressing someone in this realm. Lupin smiled. Hello, George. I wish we were meeting again under better circumstances. Am I dead? George asked hesitantly. Not yet, Lupin replied, moving closer. You're in the liminal space, the threshold between life and death. The potion and antidote have created a situation. Your spirit has been temporarily separated from your body. But I can go back, right? George pressed. Fred needs me. Lupin's expression grew sad. It's not that simple. The magic requires balance. Fred was marked for death 5 years ago, but survived. Now you've taken that mark upon yourself by administering the antidote. So I have to die instead? George asked, a chill that had nothing to do with this strange place running through what passed for his body here. That is what the magic demands, Lupin acknowledged. But magic, even dark magic, can sometimes be negotiated with. Hope flared in George. How? I'll do anything. Lupin gestured toward the mirror, which now showed Fred performing desperate resuscitation spells on George's body while tears streamed down his face. The anima vinculum potion works by forcing the victim to confront death, specifically, the death they fear most, or the death they feel they deserved but escaped, Lupin explained. For Fred, that was his own death during the Battle of Hogwarts. And for me? George asked, though he already knew the answer. For you, it's losing Fred, Lupin said gently. Your greatest fear has always been living without your twin. That's why you didn't hesitate to take his place. George nodded, unable to deny it. So how do I negotiate with the magic? By accepting what you've been avoiding for 5 years, Lupin replied. Fred survived. You both survived. But you've been living as if you lost him that day anyway, haven't you? Always waiting for the other shoe to drop, always expecting happiness to be snatched away. George thought about his behavior over the past weeks, his secretiveness, his need to protect Fred at all costs, his strange reaction to Fred's engagement. Was Lupin right? Had he never truly accepted their survival? The magic demands a death, Lupin continued. But perhaps not a physical one. Perhaps what needs to die is the fear, the part of you that's been living in the shadow of what might have been rather than embracing what is. George looked back at the mirror, where Fred was now being physically restrained by Ron as healers worked on George's body. The anguish on his twin's face was unbearable to witness. How? George asked simply. How do I do that? You need to let go, Lupin said, placing a hand on George's shoulder. Let go of the fear. Accept that your paths may diverge, that Fred's marriage, his future children, his separate life doesn't mean losing him. Accept that you, too, deserve a future that is uniquely yours. George took a deep breath, or whatever passed for breathing in this place. And if I do that, I can go back. The magic will be satisfied, Lupin confirmed. But the choice must be genuine. You can't trick magic this old and powerful. George closed his eyes, focusing on the truth of Lupin's words. For 5 years, he had lived with a shadow hanging over him, the knowledge of how close he had come to losing his other half. Even as they rebuilt their business, expanded their horizons, moved forward with their lives, part of George had remained frozen in that moment when he'd seen Fred's bloodied body being carried into the Great Hall. When Fred had announced his engagement to Angelina, that frozen part had cracked, sending spiderweb fissures through George's carefully constructed normalcy. Fred was moving forward, creating a life that would, by necessity, include less of George. And George had responded by throwing himself into danger, taking risks, perhaps unconsciously trying to prove that they were still the same, still a unit, still Fred and George rather than Fred, and also George. I understand now, George said quietly, opening his eyes to find Lupin watching him with compassion. I need to let Fred go, not lose him, but let him be his own person. And I need to be my own person too. Lupin nodded encouragingly. That's it. That's the bargain you must make with the magic. A kind of death, the death of Fred and George as a single entity, in exchange for your life. George looked back at the mirror one last time, The healers were still working frantically on his body, but something had changed. Fred was no longer struggling against Ron's restraint. Instead, he stood watching with a strange calm, his hand gripping Angelina's tightly, his expression one of absolute determination. "He's not giving up on me," George realized. "Of course not," Lupin replied with a small smile. "He's your brother. That will never change, no matter how many other roles he takes on in life." George nodded, feeling a weight lift from his spirit. "I'm ready. I choose life, my life, whatever shape it takes." As soon as he spoke the words, the mist around them began to swirl more rapidly. Lupin's form started to fade, his smile the last thing visible as he disappeared. "Good luck, George," his voice echoed. "Live well." The mirror grew larger, its surface rippling like water. George felt himself being pulled toward it, through it. There was a moment of resistance, like pushing through a membrane, and then a shocking cold followed by searing heat. With a gasping breath that felt like fire in his lungs, George opened his eyes to find himself lying on the floor of the Rosier ballroom, surrounded by anxious faces. "He's back," someone shouted, a healer he didn't recognize. "George." Fred's face appeared in his field of vision, pale with fear but alight with desperate hope. "George, can you hear me?" George tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. He managed a nod instead, which prompted Fred to let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You bloody idiot," Fred said, gripping George's hand so tightly it hurt. "What were you thinking?" George swallowed painfully and managed to croak, "Couldn't let you miss your wedding." Fred laughed through his tears. "As if I would have gone through with it without you there." Angelina appeared beside Fred, her face tear-stained but composed. "How are you feeling, George?" "Like I died and came back," George replied with a weak attempt at his usual humor. "Did we get her?" "Rosier?" "Harry and Ron have her in custody," Angelina confirmed. "Along with several others they caught trying to flee the estate. It's over." The healers insisted on moving George to St. Mungo's for observation, despite his protests that he was fine. As they prepared to transport him, George caught Fred's arm. "Fred," he said seriously, "I need you to know something." Fred leaned in, his expression worried. "What is it?" "I'm really happy for you and Angelina," George said, meaning it more genuinely than he ever had before. "And I promise not to spike the champagne at your wedding tomorrow." Fred stared at him for a moment, then burst out laughing. "You nearly die, and that's what you want to tell me? That you won't prank my wedding?" George smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Well, that, and I love you, you prat. Now go home and get some sleep. You're getting married tomorrow, and your best man needs you to look presentable." Fred's expression softened. "Love you too, Georgie. And don't worry, the wedding can wait if you need more time to recover." "Don't you dare postpone it," George warned. "I didn't come back from the dead to rearrange my schedule." As the healers finally whisked him away to St. Mungo's, George caught one last glimpse of Fred and Angelina, standing together, supporting each other. For the first time, seeing them as a couple didn't give him that strange twinge of loss. Instead, he felt only happiness for them, and a new sense of curiosity about what his own future might hold. The path ahead was unknown, but one thing was certain, it would be his path, distinct from Fred's but never truly separate. And that, George realized, was exactly as it should be. Chapter 2, Separate Paths. George Weasley woke with a start in the sterile white room of St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. For a moment, panic gripped him as he tried to remember where he was and why. Then it all came flooding back, the poisoning at the rehearsal dinner, racing to the Rosier estate, taking the antidote meant for Fred, and his strange journey to the threshold between life and death. "Finally awake, are we?" came a cheerful voice from his right. George turned to find a young healer checking his vital signs with her wand. "What time is it?" he croaked, his throat still dry and scratchy. "Just past 6 in the morning," she replied, handing him a glass of water. "You've been asleep for about 8 hours. Quite remarkable recovery, considering what you went through." George bolted upright, sloshing water over the side of the glass. 6. Fred's wedding is today. What time's the ceremony? For this afternoon, according to your very persistent brother who's been camped in our waiting room all night, the healer said with a smile. He only agreed to go home and change an hour ago when we promised to send him a Patronus the moment you woke up. George relaxed slightly, doing quick calculations in his head. If he could get discharged by 9, he'd still have plenty of time to get back to the burrow, reassure everyone he was fine, and fulfill his best man duties. So, he began casually, fixing the healer with his most charming smile, about getting out of here. The healer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Head healer Poke wants to run a few more tests before releasing you. The anima vinculum potion is extremely rare, we've only seen it in textbooks. Your case is quite interesting. I'm flattered, really, George replied dryly. But I've got a wedding to attend. My twin's getting married today, and I'm best man. Can't exactly skive off, can I? Mr. Weasley, the healer said firmly, though not unkindly, you were technically dead for almost 4 minutes last night. Your spirit was separated from your body. The fact that you're sitting up and talking right now is nothing short of miraculous. George sighed dramatically. Look, I promise to come back for all the tests you want, after the wedding. I'll be a model patient. I'll let you poke and prod to your heart's content. Just not today. The healer hesitated, then relented slightly. I'll speak with healer Poke. But I'm making no promises. That's all I ask, George said, giving her a wink that would have been more effective if he didn't look like he'd recently been on death's doorstep. After she left, George swung his legs over the side of the bed, testing his strength. His body felt odd, lightweight yet leaden at the same time, as if his connection to it had loosened somewhat. Memories of his conversation with Remus Lupin in that strange liminal space floated through his mind. Had that been real, or just some hallucination caused by the potion? Real or not, the insights he'd gained felt true. For 5 years, he'd been living in a state of suspended animation, unconsciously waiting for the other shoe to drop. Fred's engagement had forced him to confront the reality that they couldn't remain frozen in time forever, that growth meant change, and change meant sometimes walking separate paths. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Percy stood in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically disheveled, his normally pristine robes rumpled as if he'd slept in them. You're awake, Percy stated, relief evident in his voice despite his attempt at his usual formal tone. Good. Very good. Don't sound so surprised, George replied with a grin. Takes more than ancient dark magic to keep a Weasley down. Percy entered the room, carefully closing the door behind him. The healers wouldn't tell us much last night. Only that you were stable but unconscious. What happened after you took that antidote? George hesitated, unsure how to explain his otherworldly experience. It's complicated. Let's just say I had a conversation with someone who helped me see things clearly. Percy raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. Instead, he pulled a small package from his robes and placed it on the bedside table. Your wand, he explained. And fresh clothes. Fred brought them earlier. He wanted to stay, but Mother insisted he go home and rest before the wedding. She was quite adamant. I bet she was, George said, reaching gratefully for the package. How's Fred doing? And Angelina? Fred's Fred, Percy replied with a slight smile. Cracking inappropriate jokes about having to postpone the honeymoon if you don't recover in time. But he was quite affected by what happened. We all were. And the remnant? George asked, unwrapping his wand and feeling the familiar warmth as he gripped it. Did Harry and Ron get them all? Percy's expression turned grimmer. Most of them. They raided 3 locations last night based on information from Isla Rosier's memories. Caught about 15 members, including Thaddeus Knott. But they're still missing a few key players. Let me guess, George said, dread pooling in his stomach. Corvus Blackwood. Percy nodded. He wasn't among those captured. Harry thinks he might have been at the Burrow last night, disguised as one of the staff. When the plan went wrong, he likely disapparated. George swore under his breath. So he's still out there. And today's the wedding. Security has been doubled, Percy assured him. Bill and Charlie are setting up additional wards around the Burrow. Harry's stationed aurors throughout the property. Every guest will be verified before entry. George nodded, though he wasn't entirely reassured. Blackwood had already proven skilled at infiltration once. What was to stop him from trying again? I need to get out of here, he decided, standing up and immediately grabbing the bedside table as a wave of dizziness hit him. Percy was at his side in an instant, steadying him with a firm grip. Perhaps you should listen to the healers, he suggested mildly. Can't, George replied through gritted teeth. Fred needs me. The family needs me. I'm not lying in a hospital bed while Blackwood's still on the loose. Percy studied him for a moment, then nodded decisively. All right. Get dressed. I'll create a distraction. George blinked in surprise. You. Create a distraction. Who are you and what have you done with Percy Weasley? Percy's lips quirked in a rare smile. I'm still a Weasley, aren't I? Besides, I was a prefect. I know all the rules, which means I know exactly how to break them. As Percy left to implement whatever plan he had concocted, George quickly dressed in the clothes Fred had brought, a simple pair of jeans and a button-up shirt, nothing like the formal robes he'd need for the wedding later. His movements were slower than usual, his body still protesting from its recent ordeal, but determination drove him forward. Just as he finished tying his shoes, a tremendous crash echoed from somewhere down the corridor, followed by alarmed shouts and the sound of rushing footsteps. Percy appeared in the doorway, looking suspiciously innocent. We have approximately 3 minutes before they realize that the exploding bedpan incident in Ward 7 was magically induced rather than accidental, he informed George matter-of-factly. Shall we? George stared at his brother in newfound appreciation. Percy, you magnificent bastard. Lead the way. They slipped out of the room and down a back stairwell, avoiding the main corridors where healers and orderlies were rushing toward the commotion. Within minutes, they were outside in the early morning sunlight, the cool air a welcome change from the sterile hospital atmosphere. Where to now? Percy asked once they'd put some distance between themselves and St. Mungo's. The Burrow? George shook his head. Not yet. I want to check something first. How much do you know about Corvus Blackwood? Only what was in the files Harry showed us, Percy replied as they ducked into a quiet alley where they could talk without being overheard. Former low-level Death Eater. Never took the mark but supported their cause financially. Went into hiding after the Battle of Hogwarts. Resurfaced about 2 years ago and started gathering like-minded individuals. Any known addresses? Properties? Hangouts? Percy thought for a moment. There was mention of a flat in Knockturn Alley. Number 13, I believe. Why? You're not thinking of going there? That's exactly what I'm thinking, George confirmed. Blackwood's the last major threat, and he's specifically targeting our family. I want to find him before he gets anywhere near Fred's wedding. George, this is madness, Percy protested. You're in no condition to confront a dangerous dark wizard. We should inform Harry, let the Aurors handle it. The Aurors are busy guarding the Burrow and processing the remnant members they've already caught, George pointed out. Besides, we're not confronting anyone. Just doing a bit of reconnaissance. Percy looked unconvinced but adjusted his glasses in what George recognized as his accepting the inevitable gesture. Very well. But we do this carefully. No heroics. Would I ever? George asked innocently, earning a skeptical look from his brother. They apparat to the entrance of Nocturne Alley, the narrow, twisting street still largely deserted at this early hour. The few people abroad kept their heads down, hurrying about their business with the furtive air characteristic of the alley's typical clientele. Number 13 turned out to be a grim, narrow building wedged between a shop selling poisonous candles and an establishment advertising exotic ingredients, no questions asked. The windows were grimy and curtained, giving no hint of what lay within. "How do we get in?" Percy murmured as they observed the building from the shadow of a recessed doorway across the street. "I doubt knocking politely will work." George considered their options. Breaking in would trigger any protective spells Blackwood had set, alerting him to their presence. They needed a subtler approach. "We need a distraction," he decided. "Something that will draw him out." "Another exploding bedpan?" Percy suggested dryly. "Tempting, but no." George's eyes lit up as inspiration struck. "I have a better idea. Wait here." Before Percy could protest, George slipped back down the alley toward a familiar establishment, Borgin and Burke's. The infamous shop of dark artifacts was just opening for the day, the ancient proprietor removing protective spells from the door with practiced flicks of his wand. "Mr. Borgin," George called out cheerfully as he approached. "Lovely morning, isn't it?" Borgin looked up with a scowl that deepened when he recognized George. "What do you want, Weasley? Come to peddle more of your juvenile pranks?" "Actually," George replied, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "I'm in the market for something special. Something rare. I heard you might have acquired a certain timepiece recently. One with unusual properties." Borgin's expression shifted from suspicion to cautious interest. "I deal in many unusual items. You'll need to be more specific." "A pocket watch," George improvised, drawing on what he knew of the remnant's interest in the Weasley family clock. "Rumored to have belonged to Salazar Slytherin himself. Gold, with serpent engravings. Said to allow the bearer to influence time in small ways." Borgin's eyes widened slightly, not in recognition of the item, as George had hoped, but in greedy calculation. "Such an item would be immensely valuable. What makes you think I would have it?" "Word travels," George shrugged. "I heard Corvus Blackwood sold it to you just yesterday. Needed quick galleons, apparently. Running from something, they say." At the mention of Blackwood's name, Borgin's expression shuddered completely. "I don't know what you're talking about. And I don't appreciate accusations about my business associates." "No accusation," George assured him quickly. "Just eager to acquire the piece before others hear of it. I'm prepared to offer substantially more than whatever Blackwood received." "Say, double." Borgin's greedy nature warred visibly with his caution. "Finally," he said, "I have no such timepiece. But if I happen to come across one, where might I send word?" "I'll be at the White Wyvern this afternoon," George replied, naming a pub further down Nocturne Alley. "Around noon. Generous finder's fee, of course." As George walked away, he could practically feel Borgin's eyes boring into his back. He rejoined Percy with a satisfied grin. "What was that about?" Percy demanded. "Creating our distraction," George explained. "Borgin's a greedy old vulture with connections to everyone in the dark artifact trade. He'll be desperate to get his hands on a non-existent Slytherin timepiece that he can sell to me at an exorbitant price. How does that help us with Blackwood?" "Because," George said patiently, "the first thing Borgin will do is send word to Blackwood asking if he has such an item to sell." "Which means?" Understanding dawned on Percy's face. "Which means Blackwood will know you're looking for him." "Exactly," George confirmed. "And judging by his actions so far, he won't be able to resist the opportunity to set a trap for me." "So your plan," Percy summarized incredulously, "is to let a dangerous dark wizard know where you'll be, so he can try to kill you?" "More or less," George agreed cheerfully. "Except you'll be there with Auror backup, ready to capture him when he shows up." Percy pinched the bridge of his nose. This is the most reckless, ill-conceived, brilliant plan you've ever heard. George suggested. I know, right? I was going to say, suicidal, Percy corrected. You nearly died last night, George. You're in no condition to duel Blackwood if he shows up. Who said anything about dueling? George asked innocently. I'll just be having a quiet drink, waiting for a crooked shopkeeper. If Blackwood happens to appear and try something, well, that's what the Aurors are for. Percy studied him suspiciously. You're not telling me everything. George sighed. Fine. There's one more thing. I need to get into Blackwood's flat while he's distracted with me at the pub. That's where you come in. You want me to break into a dark wizard's home? Percy asked, his voice rising slightly. While you use yourself as bait? Absolutely not. Come on, Percy, George coaxed. You've already helped break me out of St. Mungo's. What's a little breaking and entering compared to that? Several additional violations of wizarding law, for starters, Percy replied stiffly. Not to mention the risk to both of us. George's expression turned serious. Look, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Blackwood is planning something for the wedding, something we haven't figured out yet. The answers might be in his flat. If we don't find them, Fred and Angelina could be in danger. Percy was silent for a long moment, internal conflict visible on his face. Finally, he adjusted his glasses in resignation. We'll need help. I'm contacting Ron. Fine, George agreed readily. Just make sure he doesn't tell Harry. Or Fred. Especially not Fred. As Percy sent a Patronus message to their younger brother, George leaned against the wall, fighting another wave of dizziness. The effects of the anima vinculum potion and antidote were still lingering, making him weaker than he'd like to admit. But he pushed the concern aside. He had roughly 6 hours until the pub meeting, and with any luck, they'd have Blackwood in custody long before Fred and Angelina exchanged their vows. Fred Weasley stared at his reflection in the mirror, adjusting his bow tie for the third time. The dress robes were the finest he'd ever owned, a deep navy blue with subtle silver embroidery along the edges, custom-made for his wedding day. He looked good, he had to admit, but his reflection couldn't hide the worry in his eyes or the tension in his shoulders. You're going to wear a hole in the carpet if you keep pacing like that, Charlie observed from where he lounged in an armchair by the window. As the second oldest Weasley brother, Charlie had been drafted to help Fred prepare when it became clear that George might not make it back from St. Mungo's in time. Still no word? Fred asked, checking his watch again. It was nearly noon, and the ceremony was scheduled for 4. George had been discharged from the hospital, or rather, had escaped, according to Percy's hastily scrawled note, hours ago, but there had been no sign of him at the Burrow. Mum sent about a dozen owls, Charlie replied. Dad's checked with the shop. Bill's asked at the hospital again. No one's seen him. Fred swore under his breath. He wouldn't miss this. Not unless. Unless he's chasing down the last of those remnant nutters, Charlie finished for him. Which, knowing George, is exactly what he's doing. I should be with him, Fred said, the words bursting out before he could stop them. If he's in danger, then he's got Percy and probably Ron with him, Charlie interrupted firmly. You're getting married today, Fred. In 4 hours, you'll be standing in front of everyone we know, promising to spend your life with Angelina. That's where you need to be. Fred ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, disrupting it completely. I know. I know that. It's just, it feels wrong. Him out there, me in here. Charlie stood up and gripped Fred's shoulders firmly. Listen to me. George almost died last night protecting you. The last thing he wants is for you to put yourself in danger on your wedding day. He's doing this so you can have your moment with Angelina without looking over your shoulder. But what if something happens to him? Fred asked, voicing the fear that had kept him awake most of the night. What if he, what if I lose him for real this time? Charlie's expression softened. Fred, you know George better than anyone. Do you really think he'd take unnecessary risks today of all days? Fred gave a reluctant chuckle. Yes. Absolutely. That's exactly what he'd do. Alright, bad example, Charlie conceded with a grin. But he's got Percy with him, and Percy's about as reckless as a hibernating flobberworm. Between the two of them, they'll be fine. Before Fred could respond, there was a knock at the door. Bill entered, his scarred face serious. Any word? Fred asked immediately. Bill shook his head. Nothing yet. But that's not why I'm here. Angelina wants to see you. Fred blinked in surprise. Now. Isn't there some rule about not seeing the bride before the wedding? Since when do Weasleys follow rules? Bill asked with a slight smile. She's in the orchard. Said it's important. Fred glanced at Charlie, who shrugged. Go on. I'll cover for you if Mum comes looking. The burrow was a hive of activity as Fred made his way downstairs and out toward the orchard. Decorations were being hung, flowers arranged, chairs set up in neat rows facing an elegant arch woven with lilies and roses. Molly was in her element, directing proceedings with military precision while somehow managing to look both frazzled and ecstatic. Fred slipped past the bustling preparations and into the relative quiet of the orchard. The apple trees were in full bloom, their pale pink blossoms creating a canopy of soft color overhead. Among them, standing with her back to him, was Angelina. She wasn't in her wedding dress yet, instead wearing simple jeans and one of Fred's old Weasley's Wizard Wheezes t-shirts. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. Fred felt his breath catch at the sight of her. I thought it was bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, he called softly as he approached. Angelina turned, a smile breaking across her face. Only if she's in her dress. Besides, I think we've had our share of bad luck already, don't you? Fred closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around her waist. More than our share. Which is why I'm surprised you wanted to tempt fate even further. Angelina studied his face, her expression growing more serious. You're worried about George. It wasn't a question, but Fred nodded anyway. No one's seen him since he left St. Mungo's. Percy's disappeared too. And Ron's been acting weird all morning. They're looking for Blackwood, Angelina said, confirming what Fred had suspected. I overheard Ron talking to Hermione. George thinks he's planning something for today. Fred's jaw tightened. And they didn't think to include me in this little mission because it's our wedding day, Angelina replied simply. They want us to have this day without worrying about revenge plots and dark wizards. Fat chance of that, Fred muttered. I can't just stand here getting married while George is out there risking his life. Again. Angelina placed her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to look at her. Fred Weasley, listen to me. I love you. I want to marry you today, in front of our friends and family. But if you need to go find your brother first, I understand. Fred stared at her in surprise. You'd postpone the wedding? If that's what you need, yes, she answered without hesitation. I'd rather have you fully present when we say our vows, not wondering if George is in danger. So go. Find him. Make sure he's safe. And then come back and marry me. Fred felt a rush of love so powerful it nearly knocked him off his feet. He pulled Angelina close and kissed her deeply, pouring all his gratitude and adoration into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Fred pressed his forehead against hers. Have I mentioned lately that you're absolutely incredible and I don't deserve you? Angelina smiled. You could stand to mention it more often. Now go. But Fred. Her expression turned serious again. Be careful. And be back by 4. I'm not waiting forever. Wouldn't dream of it, Fred promised, giving her one last quick kiss before turning toward the house. I'm going to find my idiot twin, drag him back here, and marry the most amazing witch in Britain. All before tea time. As Fred hurried back to the burrow to grab his wand and jacket, a renewed sense of purpose energized him. Angelina was right, he couldn't focus on their wedding with George potentially in danger. First, he'd ensure his twin was safe. Then, nothing would stop him from making Angelina his wife. The White Wyvern was among the seedier establishments in Knockturn Alley, which was saying something. Dark, grimy, and perpetually filled with smoke of questionable origin, it catered to those who preferred their business dealings to remain unobserved and their identities unchallenged. George sat at a corner table, nursing a butterbeer and keeping a wary eye on the door. It was just past noon, and the pub was sparsely populated, a pair of hags muttering over a cauldron of something that emitted purple sparks, a lone wizard in the far corner whose features were completely obscured by his hooded cloak, and a surly bartender who had barely grunted when taking George's order. Ron was positioned outside under a disillusionment charm, while Percy should now be breaking into Blackwood's flat with help from a young auror named Savage who specialized in curse breaking. The plan was simple: George would lure Blackwood to the pub, Ron would apprehend him, and meanwhile, Percy would search the flat for evidence of any additional plots against the Weasleys. Simple, straightforward, and with multiple points where it could go catastrophically wrong. George checked his watch again. 12:15. He took another sip of butterbeer, grimacing at the stale taste. The White Wyvern wasn't known for the quality of its refreshments. The door creaked open, and George tensed, his hand moving to his wand beneath the table. But it was only an elderly witch who shuffled to the bar and ordered a double-fire whiskey, hold the whiskey, extra fire. By 12:30, George was beginning to wonder if his plan had failed. Perhaps Borgin hadn't taken the bait. Or worse, maybe Blackwood had seen through the ruse and was currently setting a trap of his own elsewhere. Just as George was considering sending a Patronus to check on Percy's progress, the door swung open again. This time, the newcomer made George's blood run cold. It wasn't Blackwood who entered, but Fred, his dress robes exchanged for casual clothes, his hair windswept as if he'd been flying, and his expression a mixture of relief and fury as he spotted George in the corner. "You absolute prat," Fred hissed as he dropped into the chair opposite George. "Do you have any idea how worried everyone's been? Mum's having kittens, and I'm supposed to be getting married in 3.5 hours. George gaped at his twin. "What are you doing here? How did you even find me?" "Hermione," Fred replied shortly. "She overheard Ron talking to Savage about some harebrained scheme involving you as bait in the White Wyvern. Didn't take a genius to put it together." "You need to leave," George said urgently, scanning the pub for any sign of Blackwood. "Right now, Fred. I'm serious." "Not without you," Fred countered stubbornly. "Whatever you're doing, whatever danger you're chasing, we face it together. That's how it's always been." "Not this time," George insisted. "Fred, I'm trying to make sure you and Angelina have a wedding without Death Eater gatecrashers. Please, just go back to the burrow. I promise I'll be there in time for the ceremony." Fred's expression softened slightly. "George, I get why you're doing this. But after what happened last night, I can't just leave you here. I can't." The raw emotion in Fred's voice made George pause. He understood all too well what his twin was feeling, the fear of loss, the desperate need to protect each other. It was the same instinct that had driven George to take the antidote meant for Fred, to risk his own life rather than watch his brother suffer. But something had changed during George's near-death experience. His conversation with Remus Lupin in that liminal space had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of their bond. "Fred," he said gently, "I love you. You're my twin, my best friend, my other half in so many ways. But we can't keep this up. We can't keep putting our lives on hold because we're terrified of losing each other." Fred stared at him, startled by the sudden seriousness. "What are you talking about?" "You're getting married today," George continued, the words flowing now that he'd started. "You're building a life with Angelina. And that's exactly as it should be. But I need to build my own life too. We both need to stop living in the shadow of what almost happened during the battle." "I don't, you do," George interrupted firmly. "You feel guilty for being happy, for moving forward, because you think it means leaving me behind. And I've been encouraging that guilt because I've been afraid of change. But it's not healthy, Freddie. For either of us." Fred was silent for a long moment, processing George's words. Finally, he asked, "Is that what happened last night? When you took the antidote? Something changed?" George nodded slowly. "I had a conversation with Lupin. In a place between life and death. He helped me see that we've been stuck, both of us, since the battle. Frozen in fear of what might have been." "Lupin?" Fred repeated incredulously. "As in, Remus Lupin? Our former professor who died in the battle?" "I know how it sounds," George acknowledged with a small smile. "But it was real, Fred. And it made me realize that we need to stop being so afraid of living separate lives. It doesn't mean we love each other any less. It just means we're growing." Fred looked down at his hands, unusually quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I thought I'd lost you last night. When you collapsed after giving me that antidote, it was like watching a bludger heading straight for you and being unable to move." "I know," George said softly. "That's how I felt 5 years ago, when they carried you into the Great Hall." They sat in silence for a moment, the ambient noise of the pub fading into the background as they faced the fear that had defined their relationship for the past 5 years. "So what now?" Fred finally asked. "You want us to just stop being twins?" George laughed. "Bit late for that, isn't it?" "No, you prat. I want us to be brothers who support each other's separate journeys, not just twins who can't function apart. I want to be your best man today and mean it, to celebrate your marriage without feeling like I'm losing you. And I want you to let me handle this Blackwood situation without thinking you failed me somehow by getting married instead." Fred absorbed this, a slow smile spreading across his face. "When did you get so wise, Georgie?" "Near-death experiences are surprisingly educational," George replied with a grin. "Now will you please go back to the burrow before—" The rest of his sentence was cut off by a tremendous crash as the door of the pub burst open. Standing in the doorway, wand raised and face contorted with rage, was Corvus Blackwood. "Weasley," he snarled, his eyes darting between the identical twins in momentary confusion before settling on George. "Thought you could set a trap for me, did you? Thought you could use me to get to the others?" The few other patrons in the pub scattered, diving under tables or rushing for the back exit. The bartender ducked behind the counter, apparently experienced in handling sudden duels on the premises. "Actually," George replied calmly, slowly rising to his feet, "that's exactly what I thought. And it worked perfectly." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think so? Your brother and that blood traitor Savage are currently dealing with some rather nasty curses I left at my flat. And your little Auror friend outside is currently unconscious. It's just you and me, and your twin, of course." His gaze shifted to Fred, a malicious gleam in his eyes. "2 for the price of 1. How convenient." George and Fred had both drawn their wands, falling automatically into the back-to-back stance they had perfected during Dumbledore's army training. "You made one mistake, Blackwood," Fred said, his voice light despite the tension thrumming through him. "You assumed we'd be easier to take down together. When really," George continued, "you just doubled your trouble." Blackwood's response was a vicious slashing motion with his wand. "Sectum Sempra. Protego," the twins shouted in unison, their shield charms combining to deflect the curse into the wall, where it left deep gashes in the wooden paneling. What followed was a chaotic exchange of spells, with Blackwood proving himself a formidable duelist. Dark curses flew across the pub, shattering bottles behind the bar and blasting chairs to splinters. Fred and George worked in perfect synchronization, one shielding while the other attacked, then switching seamlessly. Confringo! George yelled, sending a blasting curse toward Blackwood, who deflected it into a nearby table, reducing it to kindling. Incarcerus! Fred followed up, but Blackwood dissolved the conjured ropes with a flick of his wand. Is this the best the famous Weasley twins can do? Blackwood taunted, sending a jet of purple flame that George barely dodged. I expected more from the wizards who supposedly outwitted Dolores Umbridge. We're just warming up, Fred called back, exchanging a quick glance with George that contained a full strategic conversation in a fraction of a second. Together, they began casting in rapid succession, forcing Blackwood to focus entirely on defense. This had always been their strength in duels, the unpredictable rhythm of their combined attacks, making it impossible for an opponent to establish a counterpattern. Stupefy! Fred yelled. Expelliarmus! George followed immediately. Impedimenta! Fred again. Flipendo! George continued. Blackwood managed to block the first 3 spells, but the 4th caught him off guard, sending him staggering backward into the wall. Before he could recover, Fred hit him with a trip jinx, causing him to stumble to one knee. Expelliarmus! George cast again, but this time Blackwood was ready. Protego Diabolica, he snarled, and a ring of black fire erupted around him, expanding outward with frightening speed. Down! George shouted, pulling Fred to the floor as the cursed flames roared over their heads. The heat was intense, singing their hair and raising blisters on any exposed skin. When the fire receded, Blackwood was no longer on the defensive. His face was twisted in a mask of hatred as he advanced on them, casting curse after curse in quick succession. Cruciatus! Osseo Dispersimus! Defodio! Each spell was darker than the last, designed not to subdue but to maim or kill. The twins rolled in opposite directions, making themselves harder targets, but they were running out of space in the destroyed pub. A gouging spell caught George in the side, tearing through his robes and into the flesh beneath. He gasped in pain but kept his wand steady. George! Fred called in alarm, seeing the spreading bloodstain on his twin's side. I'm fine, George gritted out, though the wound burned like fire. Focus! Blackwood laughed, sensing advantage. Not looking so clever now, are you? The Dark Lord should have eliminated your blood traitor family years ago. We're just finishing what he started. You know what your problem is, Blackwood? Fred called, trying to draw attention away from his injured brother. You talk too much. With that, he cast a silent spell directly at the ceiling above Blackwood. A large section of plaster and wooden beams came crashing down, forcing Blackwood to dive sideways to avoid being crushed. In that moment of distraction, George managed to hit him with a stunning spell. Blackwood froze mid-movement, then toppled forward onto his face. Incarcerus! Fred cast immediately, binding the stunned wizard with conjured ropes. Accio wand! Blackwood's wand flew to his hand, which he promptly snapped in half. With the immediate danger neutralized, Fred rushed to George's side. Let me see, he demanded, carefully pulling away the torn fabric to examine the wound. George winced but didn't resist. It's not as bad as it looks, he insisted, though the gash was deep and still bleeding freely. Right, because gaping wounds are usually just minor inconveniences, Fred replied sarcastically, tearing a strip from his own shirt to create a makeshift bandage. We need to get you to a healer. No time, George said, checking his watch. It's already past 1. The wedding's in less than 3 hours, and we still don't know what Blackwood was planning. As if on cue, the pub door opened again, and Ron rushed in, sporting a nasty bruise on his forehead but otherwise intact. What the bloody hell happened, he demanded, taking in the destroyed pub, the unconscious and bound Blackwood, and George's injury. I was keeping watch outside when something hit me from behind. Blackwood had backup, Fred explained, helping George to his feet. Speaking of which, what about Percy? Blackwood said something about nasty curses at his flat. Ron's expression turned grim. I tried to contact them after I came to, but got no response. We need to get over there. You two go, George said, pressing the makeshift bandage against his side. I'll take Blackwood to the ministry and then meet you at the burrow. Absolutely not, Fred said firmly. You're injured, and I'm not letting you out of my sight again. We go together or not at all. George opened his mouth to argue but was interrupted by another voice from the doorway. No one's going anywhere until someone explains why I'm missing 3 Aurors and half of Nocturne Alley is in an uproar. They turned to find Harry standing in the destroyed entrance, looking decidedly unamused. Behind him was Savage, supporting a pale but conscious Percy. Percy! Fred and George exclaimed together, relief evident in their voices. "'M'all right," Percy mumbled, though he was leaning heavily on Savage. Nasty bit of curse work on the door, triggered when we tried to enter, would have been worse if Savage hadn't recognized the signature. What were you thinking? Harry demanded, striding into the pub and surveying the destruction. Going after Blackwood without proper backup. On your wedding day, no less. This last was directed at Fred, who had the grace to look slightly abashed. Technically, it was my plan, George offered. Fred just showed up to ruin it. Excuse me for not wanting my twin to get killed hours before I get married, Fred retorted. Harry sighed heavily. We'll discuss this later. For now, we need to get you all medical attention, and I need to transport Blackwood to a secure holding cell. Wait, George said, remembering their original purpose. Percy, did you find anything in Blackwood's flat? Any clue about what they were planning for the wedding? Percy's eyes widened. The clock. I nearly forgot with all the excitement. We found plans in Blackwood's flat, detailed diagrams of the Weasley family clock. They've been studying it for months, mapping its magic. The potion was just the first phase. What's the second phase? Fred asked, dread pooling in his stomach. They created a replica, Percy explained, his voice stronger now as the importance of his discovery overrode his discomfort. An exact duplicate of our family clock, but corrupted with dark magic. They were planning to switch them during the chaos of the wedding. But why? Ron asked, perplexed. What good would a fake clock do? It wouldn't just show where family members are, Percy continued grimly. It would control where they could go. Anyone whose hand is on that clock would be trapped wherever the clock dictated, permanently. The implications sank in quickly. Their entire family, forever confined to locations chosen by their enemies, mortal peril, made literal and inescapable. Where's the fake clock now? Harry asked sharply. Still at Blackwood's flat, Percy replied. We were about to secure it when the curse triggered. Savage had just enough time to shield us from the worst of it. Harry nodded decisively. Right. Savage, take Percy to St. Mungo's. Ron, secure Blackwood and get him to the ministry holding cells. I'll retrieve the clock from Blackwood's flat. And you two, he added, looking sternly at Fred and George, are going back to the burrow. One of you has a wedding to prepare for, and the other needs medical attention. But, George began to protest. No arguments, Harry cut him off. The threat's been neutralized. Blackwood was the last high-ranking member of the remnant still at large. With him captured and their plan exposed, there's no more danger to the wedding. Fred and George exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Fred nodded. All right, but George gets his wound looked at first. And I want extra security on that family clock during the wedding, just in case. Already arranged, Harry assured him. Now go. Angelina will murder me personally if you're late to your own wedding because you were dueling dark wizards in Nocturne Alley. As they prepared to leave the ruined pub, George caught Fred's arm. I meant what I said earlier, he said quietly. About us needing to follow our own paths sometimes. Fred studied his twin's face for a moment, then smiled. I know. But that doesn't mean those paths can't run side by side. George returned the smile, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Race you back to the burrow? Loser has to dance with Great Aunt Muriel. You're on, Fred laughed, the familiar competitive glint returning to his eyes. But let's get that wound fixed first. Can't have my best man bleeding all over his dress robes, can I? By the time Fred and George returned to the burrow, the wedding preparations were in full swing. Molly nearly fainted with relief when she saw them, then immediately launched into a tirade about irresponsible behavior, and nearly giving your mother a heart attack, before rushing them both inside to get cleaned up. A healer from St. Mungo's had been called to the house to attend to the various scrapes, bruises, and in George's case, more serious injuries that had resulted from the confrontation with Blackwood. Despite George's protests that he was perfectly capable of standing up for a few hours, the healer insisted on a regime of blood-replenishing potion and healing salves for his side wound. You've torn through several layers of muscle, the healer informed him sternly as she applied a foul-smelling ointment to the gash. Without proper treatment, you could experience permanent weakness in your left side. Now hold still. George grimaced but complied, watching as Fred paced nervously around the room. It was just past 2:30, leaving barely enough time for them both to shower and change before the ceremony. Angelina's going to kill me, Fred muttered, running a hand through his hair for the dozenth time. First I disappear on our wedding day, then I come back looking like I've been dragged through a hedge backward. Technically, you were dragged through a pub backward, George corrected helpfully, earning a glare from his twin. Besides, Angelina loves you. She'll probably just be relieved you're in one piece. The healer finished bandaging George's side and packed up her supplies. No strenuous activity for at least 3 days, she instructed firmly. That means no dancing at the reception, no carrying heavy objects, and absolutely no dueling dark wizards. What about standing for extended periods while giving embarrassing best man speeches? George asked innocently. Is that allowed? The healer sighed in resignation. Try not to tear your stitches. And take this potion every 4 hours. She handed him a small vial of purple liquid. It will help manage the pain. After she left, Fred turned to George with a serious expression. You don't have to go through with this today. I'm sure everyone would understand if you needed to rest. George stared at his twin incredulously. Are you mental? Miss my only brother's wedding? Not a chance. I have 5 other brothers, Fred pointed out. Yes, but you only have one favorite brother, George replied with a grin. Now stop fussing and go shower. You smell like a troll's armpit, and I refuse to stand next to that all afternoon. Fred laughed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Fine. But if you start feeling worse, I'll let you know, George promised. Now go. The sooner you're clean, the sooner you can start panicking about your vows instead. Fred's eyes widened in alarm. My vows. I was supposed to finalize them this morning, but then, relax, George interrupted, pulling a folded piece of parchment from his pocket. I wrote them for you. Well, technically, I wrote them for me to give to you when you inevitably forgot to write your own. Fred took the parchment with a mixture of relief and suspicion. How did you know what I wanted to say? George tapped his temple with a finger. Twin telepathy. Also, you talk in your sleep. Have done since we were kids. Very informative, especially the night after you first kissed Angelina. Fred threw a pillow at him, which George caught despite his injury. Git, Fred muttered, but there was no heat in it. You're welcome, George replied cheerfully. Now seriously, go shower. You've got a witch to marry. As Fred headed for the bathroom, George leaned back carefully against the headboard, mindful of his bandaged side. The pain was manageable thanks to the healer's potion, but exhaustion was beginning to set in. Between his escape from St. Mungo's that morning, the confrontation with Blackwood, and the lingering effects of his near-death experience the night before, his body was running on fumes. But he wouldn't miss Fred's wedding for anything. Not after everything they'd been through to ensure it happened safely. Not after the revelations he'd experienced in that liminal space between life and death. Today marked a turning point, not just for Fred and Angelina, but for George as well. For the first time since the Battle of Hogwarts, he felt truly at peace with the idea of their paths diverging, of Fred building a life that centered around someone other than his twin. It didn't mean they would lose their connection. If anything, George reflected, choosing to support each other's separate journeys would only strengthen the bond they shared. With that comforting thought, George closed his eyes, allowing himself a brief moment of rest before the ceremony that would change everything, and nothing at all. The garden of the Burrow had been transformed into a vision of elegance that somehow still retained the warmth and character of the Weasley family home. Rows of white chairs faced an archway woven with lilies and roses, beneath which Fred now stood, looking more nervous and happy than George had ever seen him. Despite the morning's adventures, everything had come together perfectly. The guests were seated, the string quartet, enchanted instruments playing themselves, filled the air with gentle music, and the golden afternoon sunlight bathed everything in a warm glow. George stood beside Fred at the archway, both of them in their matching dress robes. George's side still throbbed occasionally, but he ignored it, focusing instead on his brother's barely contained excitement. "Breathe," George murmured as they watched the bridesmaids begin their procession down the aisle. "You look like you might pass out, and I'm not sure I can catch you with these stitches." Fred exhaled shakily. "What if I mess up the vows? What if I trip? What if you stop worrying and enjoy marrying the witch of your dreams?" George suggested with a grin. "Seriously, Freddie, everything's perfect. The remnant's been dealt with, the clock is under guard, and in about 10 minutes, you'll be married to Angelina Johnson. Life is good." Fred nodded, straightening his shoulders. "You're right. You're absolutely right." And then all conversation ceased, because Angelina had appeared at the end of the aisle, and Fred seemed to forget how to breathe entirely. She was radiant in a simple but elegant white gown that hugged her athletic figure before flowing out into a modest train. Her dark hair was swept up with a few curls framing her face, and her smile as she locked eyes with Fred was blinding in its joy. George glanced sideways at his brother and felt a surge of pure happiness at Fred's expression, a mixture of awe, love, and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite fathom his own good fortune. As Angelina reached the altar, escorted by her beaming father, Fred stepped forward to take her hand. The officiant, a dignified wizard from the ministry, began the ceremony with traditional words about love and commitment, but George barely heard them. He was too focused on the transformative joy radiating from his twin. When the time came for vows, Fred pulled out the parchment George had given him earlier. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded it, but his voice was strong and clear as he began to read. "Angelina," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "you've known me since we were 11 years old, which means you've had plenty of time to come to your senses and run the other way." A ripple of laughter went through the assembled guests. "The fact that you're still here," Fred continued, "still choosing me despite knowing all my worst jokes, most ridiculous pranks, and most dangerous ideas, is nothing short of miraculous. You've seen me at my best and at my absolute worst. You were there when I nearly died, and you helped put me back together afterward." Fred's voice caught slightly, and he took a moment to compose himself before continuing. "Most people think they know Fred and George Weasley, the pranksters, the troublemakers, the identical twins who finish each other's sentences. But you, Angelina, you've always seen me. Just me. Fred. Different from George in ways that matter to you, even when others couldn't tell us apart." George felt his own throat tighten with emotion. He hadn't written this part, these were Fred's own words, coming straight from his heart. "I promise to spend the rest of my life making you laugh," Fred went on, his voice stronger now. "I promise to never stop surprising you, challenging you, and supporting you in everything you do. I promise to be your partner in all things, from raising our future children to thrashing you at Quidditch in the garden." Another laugh from the audience, and a playful glare from Angelina. Most of all, Fred concluded, I promise to love you completely, honestly, and with everything I am. Not as half of Fred and George, but as Fred Weasley, the man who has been hopelessly in love with you since 4th year and who still can't believe his luck that you love him back. Tears were streaming freely down Angelina's face now, but her smile never wavered. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was steady and full of emotion. Fred Weasley, she began, loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. You make me laugh when I want to cry, you challenge me when I need pushing, and you support me when I need strength. You're brilliant, creative, brave, and occasionally completely maddening, and I wouldn't have you any other way. Fred grinned at this, and George could see his brother relaxing into the moment, the last of his nervousness melting away under Angelina's loving gaze. I promise to be your teammate in all things, Angelina continued. To celebrate your successes, comfort you in your failures, and occasionally hex you when you deserve it. This drew appreciative chuckles from the Weasley family in particular. I promise to always see you for exactly who you are, not just a twin, not just a prankster, but the complex, wonderful man I've fallen in love with. And I promise to remind you of that every day for the rest of our lives. The exchange of rings followed, and then the officiant raised his wand, creating a shower of golden stars that fell gently around the couple as he pronounced them bonded for life. You may now kiss the bride, he announced, though Fred was already pulling Angelina into an enthusiastic embrace that left no doubt about his feelings. The assembled guests erupted in cheers and applause. George led the celebration, Wolf whistling loudly despite the twinge it sent through his injured side. As Fred and Angelina turned to face their friends and family for the first time as husband and wife, George caught his twin's eye and gave him a wink and a thumbs up. In that moment, seeing Fred's pure, uncomplicated happiness, George knew with absolute certainty that everything was exactly as it should be. Their paths might diverge in ways they hadn't anticipated 5 years ago, but the bond between them remained unbreakable, transformed, perhaps, but no less powerful for the change. The reception was in full swing as twilight descended on the borough. Lanterns floated among the trees, casting a warm, golden glow over the festivities. Tables had been cleared away to create a dance floor, where Fred and Angelina were currently leading guests in a lively dance to music provided by a popular wizarding band. George sat at a table on the edge of the celebration, nursing a butterbeer and watching the proceedings with a contented smile. His side was beginning to ache again, a reminder that he was overdue for another dose of the healer's potion. But he was reluctant to miss even a moment of the joyful chaos around him. Not dancing? Asked a voice behind him, and George turned to find Angelina's friend Katie Bell standing there, looking lovely in periwinkle dress robes. Healer's orders, George replied, gesturing to his side. Apparently dueling dark wizards the day of your twins' wedding is irresponsible and medically inadvisable. Katie laughed, taking the seat beside him. I heard about your adventure in Nocturne Alley. Typical Weasley twins, can't even have a normal wedding day without some death-defying heroics thrown in. To be fair, I was trying to prevent the death-defying part, George pointed out. Fred's the one who crashed my carefully orchestrated plan and turned it into a free-for-all. Katie's expression turned more serious as she studied him. How are you really doing, George? And I don't mean the injury. George knew what she was asking. Katie had been there during the Battle of Hogwarts, she'd seen the aftermath, the way both twins had been changed by Fred's near-death experience. I'm good, he said, and meant it. Better than I've been in a long time, actually. Even though your other half just married someone else? Katie asked gently. George considered this, watching as Fred spun Angelina around the dance floor, both of them laughing with uninhibited joy. That's just it, he said slowly. He's not my other half. Not anymore. He's my brother, my twin, my best friend, but he's his own person. And so am I. Katie looked surprised but pleased. That's surprisingly mature of you, George Weasley. Don't sound so shocked, George protested with mock offense. I'll have you know I've been maturing steadily at a rate of approximately 1% per year since leaving Hogwarts. Katie laughed again, the sound warming something in George's chest. At that rate, you'll be a proper adult by the time you're, 118. Give or take, George agreed cheerfully. But I've had a recent growth spurt in the maturity department. Nearly dying twice in 24 hours will do that to a person. Katie's expression sobered. I heard about that too. George, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. When Angelina told me what happened at the rehearsal dinner. It turned out all right in the end, George assured her, touched by her concern. And I learned something important from the experience. What's that? Katie asked curiously. George took a moment to gather his thoughts, wanting to articulate the profound shift he'd experienced. I learned that sometimes the things we fear most aren't what we think they are. I've spent 5 years terrified of losing Fred, of our paths diverging. But what I really needed to fear was never fully living my own life because of that fear. Katie's eyes widened slightly. That's really profound, George. I know, he agreed with an exaggerated air of wisdom. I'm thinking of having it printed on t-shirts. George Weasley, philosopher prankster. Buy a puking pastille, get a life lesson free. Katie dissolved into giggles, and George found himself admiring the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed. He'd always liked Katie, they'd played Quidditch together at Hogwarts, and she'd been a frequent visitor to the joke shop over the years. But something felt different now, a new awareness that hadn't been there before. Before he could examine this feeling further, Fred appeared at their table, slightly out of breath from dancing. George! There you are, he exclaimed, dropping into a chair across from them. Angelina's gone to freshen up, and I wanted to check on you. How's the war wound? Still attached to my body, so I'm counting it as a win, George replied. Shouldn't you be mingling with your guests, Mr. Married Man? Fred waved a dismissive hand. They can wait. My brother nearly died saving my life yesterday, then got himself sliced open capturing a dark wizard this morning. I think I'm entitled to spend 5 minutes making sure he's all right. I'm fine, George assured him. Katie's been keeping me company. Fred's eyes darted between them, a knowing smile spreading across his face. Has she, now? How, interesting. Katie rolled her eyes. Don't start, Fred. We're just talking. Of course, Fred agreed, though his expression remained annoyingly smug. Just two old friends having a chat at a wedding. Nothing significant about that at all. George kicked him under the table, eliciting a satisfying yelp. Ignore him, Katie. Marriage has clearly addled what few brains he had left. Katie laughed, rising from her seat. I should go find Alicia anyway. She was threatening to corner Oliver Wood for a dance, and someone needs to save him. She smiled warmly at George. Don't be a stranger, George. And take care of that injury. As she walked away, Fred leaned forward, eyebrows raised suggestively. Well. Shut up, George said without heat. I didn't say anything. Fred protested, the picture of innocence. You were thinking it very loudly, George countered. And there's nothing to say. Katie and I are friends. That's all. If you say so, Fred replied, clearly unconvinced. But just so you know, she's been asking Angelina about you for months. How's George doing? Is George seeing anyone? Does George still like treacle tart or has his taste changed along with his relationship status? George felt his ears grow warm, a telltale Weasley trait. She has not. Has too, Fred insisted. Ask Angelina if you don't believe me. Before George could respond, a familiar silvery light appeared at the edge of the dance floor. Conversations died down as the luminous Lynx Patronus of Kingsley Shacklebolt padded gracefully through the crowd, stopping in front of Harry, who had been dancing with Ginny. The Patronus spoke in Kingsley's deep, reassuring voice, Potter. Urgent situation at the ministry. Blackwood escaped during transport. Last seen heading toward Ottery St. Catchpole. Additional orders en route. Maintain security until arrival. The message delivered, the Patronus dissolved into wisps of silver mist, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. George was on his feet immediately, ignoring the sharp pain in his side. Fred had also risen, his expression shifting from shock to determination in seconds. "Everyone inside," Harry called out, taking charge of the situation. "The burrow has stronger protective enchantments than the garden." Guests began moving quickly but orderly toward the house, shepherded by Bill and Charlie. Molly and Arthur were helping the elderly and children, while Percy coordinated with Ron to secure the perimeter. Fred turned to George. "Find Angelina. Get her inside with the others. I'm going to help Harry set up defensive positions." For a moment, George wanted to protest, to insist on fighting alongside his twin as they always had. But something stopped him, the recognition that this time, their priorities needed to be different. Fred's first concern had to be his new wife, and George could respect that. On it, he nodded, drawing his wand despite the pain it caused his injured side. "Be careful." "Always am," Fred replied with a quick grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You too." As they separated, George scanning the crowd for Angelina while Fred joined Harry near the property boundary, a strange calm settled over George. Despite the danger, despite the interruption of what should have been a perfect day, he felt oddly at peace with this new dynamic. He spotted Angelina emerging from the house, looking confused at the sudden rush of guests heading her way. "What's happening?" she called to George as he approached. "Blackwood escaped," he explained quickly, guiding her back toward the doorway. "Ministry thinks he's headed this way." Angelina's eyes widened, but she remained impressively composed. "Where's Fred?" "Setting up defenses with Harry," George replied, impressed by her steady reaction. "He asked me to make sure you're safe." For a brief moment, something like disappointment flickered across Angelina's face. But it was quickly replaced by determination as she drew her own wand. "I'm not hiding in the house while my husband faces danger," she stated firmly. "I was in Dumbledore's army too, remember?" George couldn't help but grin. "Fred's a lucky man." "He'd better remember that," Angelina replied with a fierce smile. "Now, where do you need me?" Before George could answer, a thunderous crack split the air, not the pop of apparition, but something more violent, like the sound of reality itself being torn apart. At the edge of the property, just beyond the protective wards, a swirling vortex of dark energy had appeared. From its depths stepped Corvus Blackwood, his face contorted with rage and madness, his robes billowing around him in an unnatural wind. "Weasleys," he roared, his voice magically amplified to carry across the property. "Your day of reckoning has come. The remnant will not be denied its justice." George pushed Angelina behind him instinctively, raising his wand despite knowing they were too far away for an effective spell. Across the garden, he could see Fred and Harry doing the same, with Ron, Bill, and Charlie spreading out to create a defensive line. "That's not normal apparition," Angelina murmured, her voice tense. "How did he break through the wards?" "I don't know," George admitted. The protective enchantments around the burrow had been strengthened significantly after the war, with additional layers added specifically for the wedding. They shouldn't have been breachable, especially not by a lone wizard, no matter how powerful. As if reading their thoughts, Blackwood laughed, a chilling sound that echoed unnaturally across the garden. "Wondering how I penetrated your precious defenses? Your family clock provided the key. Once touched by the anima vinculum, it created a bond that no ward can break." George's blood ran cold. The clock. He's using it somehow to bypass the wards. "But Harry secured it," Angelina protested. "He said it was safe." "The original is," George realized with growing dread. "But the fake, the one they created as a duplicate, it must have already been connected to our clock's magic." Blackwood raised his wand, pointing it directly at the house. Your family has interfered with the natural order for the last time. Blood traitors, all of you. Now watch as I destroy everything you hold dear, starting with this miserable hovel you call home. Protego Maxima. Multiple voices cast the shield charm simultaneously as Blackwood unleashed a massive jet of cursed fire toward the burrow. The combined shields intercepted the flames, but the force of the impact sent visible shockwaves through the magical barrier. George made a split-second decision. Angelina, find Fred. Tell him Blackwood is using the duplicate clock to channel his attack. It must be nearby, he wouldn't risk separating himself from it. What about you? Angelina demanded. I'm going to create a distraction, George replied grimly. Blackwood and I have unfinished business from this morning. Before she could protest, George was moving, not toward the defensive line where the others were holding off Blackwood's assault, but circling around toward the orchard, staying low and using the wedding decorations as cover. If Blackwood was channeling his power through the duplicate clock, the artifact had to be close by. And if George could find and disable it, they might have a chance of cutting off Blackwood's ability to breach the wards. As he crept through the shadows of the apple trees, George could hear the sounds of battle intensifying behind him, spells crashing against shields, voices shouting incantations, the occasional cry of pain or warning. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to fight alongside his family as he always had. But this was different. This required a different kind of courage, the willingness to separate from the group, to trust that Fred and the others could handle the frontal assault while he attacked the problem from another angle. The orchard gave way to the open field that bordered the Weasley property. And there, nestled in the tall grass about 50 yards from where Blackwood was mounting his assault, was a small, pulsating object. Even from a distance, George could see the warped resemblance to the Weasley family clock, but this version was twisted, its hands bent at unnatural angles, its face glowing with sickly green light. George approached cautiously, wand at the ready. The clock seemed to sense his presence, its hands twitching erratically as he drew nearer. Up close, the corruption was even more evident, where the Weasley clock showed locations like home, work, traveling, this twisted version displayed options like suffering, dying, and lost forever. And most disturbing of all, each hand bore the name of a Weasley family member, with Fred and George's hands prominently featured at the top of the dial. Admiring my handiwork, came Blackwood's voice from behind him. George spun around, a shield charm already forming on his lips, but he wasn't quite fast enough. Blackwood's stunning spell caught him in the shoulder, sending him staggering backward. I wondered if one of you might figure it out, Blackwood continued, advancing slowly, his wand trained on George. The clock connection was Isla's idea, brilliant, really. Your family's most cherished magical heirloom, turned against you. George managed to steady himself, though his injured side was screaming in protest and his wand arm felt numb from the stunning spell. What happened to your dramatic standoff with the others? He asked, trying to buy time to recover. Got tired of being outnumbered 6-1. Blackwood smiled coldly. That was merely a projection, a useful bit of magic when one wants to be in two places at once. The real me has been waiting here all along, guarding the clock. I knew someone would try to find it eventually. Clever, George acknowledged, his mind racing. If Blackwood's presence at the wards was just a projection, that meant the others were essentially fighting a phantom, one that could cause real damage through the clock's connection, but couldn't be defeated directly. But there's a flaw in your plan. Oh. Blackwood raised an eyebrow, clearly humoring him. And what might that be? You're still outnumbered, George replied simply. Just not in the way you think. Before Blackwood could respond, a jet of red light shot past George's ear, narrowly missing Blackwood, who dove sideways with surprising agility. Fred emerged from the tall grass to George's right, his wand aimed squarely at Blackwood. Starting the party without me, Georgie? Bad form. Angelina appeared on George's left, her own wand steady. Sorry we're late. Your directions could have been clearer. George couldn't help but grin despite the danger. Thought you two would be busy with the projection. Harry and the others have it contained, Fred explained, not taking his eyes off Blackwood, who had regained his footing and was watching them warily. Figured you might need backup for the real threat. How touching, Blackwood sneered. The twins reunited for one last stand. And the bride too. How convenient, I can eliminate all of you at once. You'll have to catch us first, Fred taunted, and as if they had rehearsed it, all three of them scattered in different directions just as Blackwood unleashed a barrage of curses. What followed was an intense, chaotic duel. Blackwood was surprisingly mobile, ducking and weaving between their spells while maintaining a steady offensive of his own. Fred and George fell naturally into their old dueling pattern, alternating shields and attacks in perfect rhythm, while Angelina added her own formidable skills to the mix. But Blackwood had one significant advantage, the clock. Whenever he was directly threatened, he would touch it briefly with his wand, sending a pulse of dark energy that disrupted their spells and seemed to reinvigorate him. We need to destroy that clock. George called to the others as they regrouped behind a large fallen log during a momentary lull. Tried that, Fred panted, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek. Hit it with a reductor curse while you were distracting him. Didn't even scratch it. It must be protected by the same magic that's powering it, Angelina reasoned. We need to break the connection to our family clock first. George's mind raced, thinking back to what they'd learned about the anima vinculum potion. The connection, it's based on sympathetic magic. Like affecting like. English, please, Fred requested as he peered over the log to track Blackwood's movements. It's using our clock's magical signature to target our family, George explained rapidly. But what if we gave it a different target? Something more immediate? Angelina caught on first. You want to redirect the connection. Exactly, George confirmed. But we'd need something with a strong magical signature, something tied to Blackwood himself. Fred's eyes lit up with understanding. His wand. If we can get his wand and place it on the clock, it would create a feedback loop, George finished. The clock would target him instead of us. Great plan, Angelina said, but how exactly do we get his wand? He's not exactly going to hand it over. Fred and George exchanged glances, 5 years of shared mischief and mayhem allowing them to communicate an entire plan without words. Angelina, Fred said, turning to his wife with sudden seriousness, I know we just got married, and I promise to always protect you, but I'm about to ask you to do something very dangerous. Angelina's eyes narrowed. If you're about to suggest I sit this one out, quite the opposite, George interrupted with a grin. We need you to be the bait. To her credit, Angelina didn't hesitate. Tell me what to do. The plan was simple, bordering on reckless, but it was the best they could manage under the circumstances. Angelina would draw Blackwood's attention with a frontal assault while Fred and George circled behind him. If they timed it perfectly, they might be able to disarm him long enough to get his wand to the clock. Ready? George asked, meeting each of their eyes. Born ready, Fred replied with his old, familiar grin, the one that had preceded so many of their most audacious pranks at Hogwarts. Let's end this, Angelina agreed, her expression fierce and determined. They moved simultaneously, Angelina bursting from behind the log with a barrage of stunning spells while Fred and George split in opposite directions, using disillusionment charms to blend with the tall grass as they circled around. Blackwood responded exactly as they'd hoped, focusing his attention on the immediate threat of Angelina's aggressive spellcasting. He didn't notice the twins closing in from either side, too intent on repelling Angelina's impressively coordinated attack. Is this the best you can do, Mrs. Weasley? Blackwood taunted as he deflected spell after spell. Your husband married below his station, it seems, though blood traders can hardly be choosers. Angelina didn't rise to the bait, maintaining her focus as she drove Blackwood gradually backward, toward where the clock lay pulsing in the grass. When he was perfectly positioned, she executed a complex wand movement that sent a spiral of blue flames toward him, not aimed to hit, but to force him to defend on multiple fronts. In that crucial moment of divided attention, Fred and George struck. Expelliarmus, they shouted in perfect unison, their spells combining into a single, powerful disarming charm that caught Blackwood completely by surprise. His wand flew from his hand, arcing high into the air. George lunged forward, ignoring the tearing pain in his side as he caught it deftly, a skill honed through years as a beater. "Fred, now," he yelled, tossing the wand to his twin, who was closer to the clock. Blackwood roared with rage, abandoning his duel with Angelina to charge bodily at Fred. But Angelina was faster, hitting him with a tripped jinx that sent him sprawling face-first into the dirt. Fred reached the clock and slammed Blackwood's wand down onto its face. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the clock began to vibrate, its hands spinning wildly as the sickly green glow intensified. "Get back!" George shouted, grabbing Angelina's arm and pulling her away from the clock. Fred scrambled backward just as the clock emitted a high-pitched whine. Blackwood had regained his feet and was staring at the clock in horror. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the clock's increasing noise. "Created a feedback loop," George explained grimly. "Your wand, your magical signature, the clock now sees you as the target." "No," Blackwood breathed, taking a step toward the clock. "That's not possible. The sympathetic connection was keyed to your family's blood that you drew when you attacked us," Fred pointed out. "Which means your wand carries traces of our magical signature mixed with yours. Perfect for confusing your little toy." The clock's whine had become deafening, its hands spinning so rapidly they were a blur. Blackwood lunged for it, desperation evident in his movements, but it was too late. The clock exploded in a blast of green light, the shockwave knocking all four of them off their feet. When George's vision cleared, he saw Blackwood lying motionless several yards away, his body smoking slightly, his eyes open but unseeing. The clock had been reduced to twisted metal and broken glass, scattered across the field like strange confetti. Fred was the first to recover, rushing to help Angelina to her feet. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently, checking her for injuries. "I'm fine," she assured him, though she was shaking slightly from adrenaline. "You?" "Never better," Fred replied with a slightly manic grin. "Nothing like a duel to the death to work up an appetite for wedding cake." George pushed himself up more slowly, his side wound having definitely reopened during the confrontation. But despite the pain, he felt a profound sense of satisfaction. They had faced the danger together, not as an inseparable unit, but as three individuals working in concert, each playing a crucial role that the others couldn't have fulfilled. As they made their way back toward the burrow, supporting each other over the uneven ground, George caught Fred's eye. A wordless understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted, not just in their circumstances but in their relationship itself. They were still Fred and George, still twins, still brothers. But they were also individuals with their own paths to follow, their own choices to make, their own lives to lead. And somehow, that made their bond stronger, not weaker. When they reached the edge of the orchard, they found the rest of the family waiting anxiously. The projection Blackwood had created had vanished the moment the real Blackwood fell, leaving everyone confused and worried. "There they are!" Molly cried, rushing forward to envelop all three of them in a fierce hug that ignored their various injuries. "Oh, my dears! We were so worried when you disappeared from the battle." "Sorry, Mum," Fred said, wincing as she squeezed his bruised ribs. "Had to take care of the real threat while everyone else was distracted by the light show." Harry approached, looking both relieved and exasperated. "You could have told someone your plan." "Didn't exactly have time for a committee meeting," George pointed out cheerfully. "Besides, it worked, didn't it?" "Blackwood?" Ron asked. "Dead," Angelina replied soberly. "The clock backfired on him when we reversed the connection." A somber silence fell over the group at this news, quickly broken by Bill. "Well, that's that, then. The threat's over. The question is, what do we do about the wedding reception?" All eyes turned to Fred and Angelina, who exchanged a brief glance before Fred spoke. Well, we've got a garden full of food, drink, and guests. Seems a shame to waste it. Plus, George added with a grin, I still haven't given my best man speech. And after saving the day, I think I've earned the right to thoroughly embarrass my brother in front of everyone he knows. That broke the tension, sending ripples of laughter through the family. As they made their way back to the reception area, Fred fell into step beside George, while Angelina moved ahead to speak with her parents, who had been frantic with worry. You know, Fred said quietly, for a moment there, I thought we might actually die in that field. On your wedding day? George replied. Wouldn't dream of it. Angelina would have killed us herself if we'd ruined the reception by dying. Fred laughed, but his expression remained serious. I meant what I said earlier, George. About our paths running side by side, even if they're not the same path anymore. George nodded, understanding completely. I know. And I wouldn't want it any other way. As the sun set over the burrow, casting long shadows across the garden where guests were now cautiously returning to the celebration, George watched his twin rejoin his new wife. They moved together onto the dance floor, picking up almost exactly where they'd left off before Blackwood's interruption, as if determined not to let darkness claim even a minute more of their special day. And for the first time since the Battle of Hogwarts, George felt completely at peace with the future, whatever it might hold, whatever separate paths they might walk. Because some bonds couldn't be broken, not by dark magic, not by marriage, not even by death itself. Some bonds simply changed shape, growing stronger in their new form. With that comforting thought, George made his way to the bandstand, ready to deliver the best man speech he'd been preparing for weeks. After all, what was a wedding without a little well-intentioned embarrassment from the best man? Chapter 3, Brothers Beyond Blood. George winced as the healer tightened the fresh bandage around his torso. Despite his protests that he was absolutely fine and barely bleeding anymore, Molly had insisted on proper medical attention before he rejoined the wedding reception. A compromise had been reached. George would submit to treatment in Arthur's shed while the celebration resumed, rather than being whisked off to St. Mungo's. You've torn open the wound completely, the healer scolded, a middle-aged witch with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor who had been summoned from the village. What part of no strenuous activity was unclear. The part where Death Eaters crash my brother's wedding, George replied cheerfully. Must have missed that in the fine print. The healer snorted, unimpressed. Well, you're lucky it's a clean tear. I've resealed it, but you need to take it easy. And I mean it this time. No more duels to the death today, George promised solemnly. Just some dancing, drinking, and embarrassing speech-giving. Standard best man duties. The dancing is out, she said firmly, packing away her supplies. Drink if you must, but nothing stronger than butterbeer if you're taking the pain potion. And make your speech sitting down. George saluted. Yes, ma'am. After the healer departed, George carefully pulled his dress shirt back on, buttoning it slowly. The shed door creaked open, and Percy poked his head in. Still alive, then? He asked dryly. Disappointed? George shot back with a grin. Percy entered fully, closing the door behind him. Ministry officials have taken Blackwood's body. Harry's giving them a statement now. He hesitated, then added, that was some impressive spell work out there. Redirecting the magical connection to the clock. George raised his eyebrows in mock astonishment. Was that a compliment, Percy? Should I alert the prophet? Don't push it, Percy warned, though his lips twitched slightly. I've contacted the Department of Magical Artifacts about the remains of the duplicate clock. They'll want to study it, make sure there aren't others like it. Always the bureaucrat, George teased, but without malice. After all, Percy's attention to protocol and procedure had proven invaluable throughout their confrontation with the remnant. Percy helped George to his feet, steadying him when he swayed slightly. Fred's looking for you. The guests are clamoring for the best man speech. Can't disappoint the adoring public, George said, taking a deep breath and straightening his shoulders. The pain in his side had dulled to a manageable throb, thanks to the healer's potion. "How does the reception look? Has everyone calmed down?" Surprisingly, yes, Percy replied as they made their way out of the shed. After the initial panic, most guests seemed to be treating the whole incident as unexpected entertainment. The fact that the danger was dispatched so quickly helped. "And Mums brought out the extra strong mead. Always the solution to post-battle jitters," George nodded sagely. The evening had fully descended now, with hundreds of enchanted lanterns casting a warm, golden glow over the garden. The band was playing again, a lively tune that had drawn several couples to the dance floor. At the center were Fred and Angelina, moving together with the easy grace of two athletes perfectly in sync with each other. George paused at the edge of the celebration, struck by the scene before him. Despite the interruption, despite the danger, despite everything, the wedding was continuing exactly as planned. There was something profoundly defiant in that, a refusal to let darkness intrude any further on this day of joy. Fred spotted him and whispered something to Angelina before making his way over, weaving through guests with quick apologies and smiles. "There you are!" Fred exclaimed, clapping George on his uninjured shoulder. "Thought you might have snuck off to St. Mungo's after all. And miss my big speech?" "Not a chance," George replied, studying his twin's face. Despite the cheerful demeanor, Fred's eyes betrayed lingering concern. "I'm fine, Freddie. Healer says I'll live, though dancing's off the table." Fred's expression relaxed slightly. "Shame. I was looking forward to watching you attempt to waltz with Great Aunt Muriel." "That would definitely reopen the wound," George agreed with a shudder. "How's everyone else?" "A few minor injuries from the panic, nothing serious," Fred reported. "Ron's got a spectacular bruise from where he ran into a table, but he's telling everyone it's from heroically battling Blackwood." "And the clock? Our real one?" "Safe," Fred assured him. "Bill's checked it thoroughly, no trace of dark magic. Whatever connection Blackwood established, it died with him and the duplicate." George nodded, relieved. The family clock had been a fixture in the burrow for as long as he could remember, its hands tracking each family member through the events of their lives. The thought of it being corrupted, used against them, had been particularly disturbing. "Well then," George said, straightening his bow tie, "I believe I have a speech to deliver. Unless you'd prefer I skip it, given the excitement we've already had today." Fred snorted. "Not a chance. You've been hinting for weeks that this speech would make history and possibly get you disowned. I'm not letting you off the hook now." As they rejoined the reception, George was struck by a wave of affection for his twin. Despite everything they'd been through, Fred's near death during the Battle of Hogwarts, the attack at the rehearsal dinner, today's confrontation with Blackwood, here they were, bickering about a wedding speech as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Perhaps that was the true magic of their bond. Not the ability to finish each other's sentences or pull off identical pranks, but the capacity to return to normalcy after the extraordinary, to find humor in the aftermath of danger. The guests noticed their arrival and began to cheer, glasses raising in anticipation of George's speech. Fred led him to the small platform where the band was set up, conjuring a chair with a flick of his wand. "Healer's orders," he explained with a wink. "No standing for the wounded hero." "I'm never going to hear the end of this, am I?" George muttered as he carefully lowered himself into the chair. "Not in this lifetime," Fred confirmed cheerfully, then turned to address the gathered guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, wizards and witches, and whatever Hagrid is," a rumble of good-natured laughter came from the corner where Hagrid sat, occupying what appeared to be a specially reinforced bench. "It's time for what you've all been waiting for. The best man's speech," Fred announced with a flourish. "And who better to serve as my best man than the person who's been by my side since before birth? The slightly less handsome, slightly less funny, but infinitely more troublesome George Weasley." The crowd applauded enthusiastically as Fred handed George a glass of champagne and stepped aside. George took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of familiar faces, family, friends, professors, teammates, all gathered to celebrate Fred and Angelina. His prepared speech, full of embarrassing anecdotes and clever wordplay, suddenly felt inadequate after the day's events. For those who don't know me, George began with a smile, I'm Fred's twin brother. Which means I've had the unique experience of going through life with someone who makes all the same mistakes I do, but somehow manages to blame me for them. Laughter rippled through the audience, and George felt himself relaxing into the moment. I had a whole speech prepared, 5 pages of Fred's most embarrassing moments, 3 diagrams explaining how he finally convinced Angelina to date him, and a dramatic reenactment of his first attempt at brewing amortentia in 4th year, which somehow resulted in the entire Gryffindor Quidditch team speaking in limericks for a week. More laughter, with Angelina shaking her head in mock disapproval. But given today's unexpected excitement, George continued, his tone shifting to something more sincere, I find myself thinking about different things. About family. About bonds that can't be broken, even when they're tested. The crowd grew quieter, listening intently. Fred and I have been inseparable since birth. We've done everything together, played the same sports, took the same classes, started the same business, even lost body parts in a somewhat matching set. George gestured to his missing ear, earning appreciative chuckles. For a long time, I think people saw us as a single unit. Fred and George. The Weasley twins. Indivisible and interchangeable. He glanced at Fred, who was watching him with unusually serious eyes. But the thing about twins, about brothers, is that you're not actually the same person. You're 2 separate people who happen to share an extraordinarily strong bond. And sometimes, growing up means recognizing and celebrating those differences, not just the similarities. George shifted in his chair, wincing slightly as his side protested the movement. 5 years ago, during the Battle of Hogwarts, Fred nearly died. George's voice grew softer, but in the hushed attention of the crowd, every word carried clearly. For a few terrible minutes, I thought he had. And in that moment, I learned something about bonds like ours. They don't break when paths diverge. They stretch. They adapt. They transform. Fred's eyes were suspiciously bright now, and Angelina had moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. Today, Fred took another step on his own path by marrying this incredible woman. George raised his glass toward Angelina. And I couldn't be happier for both of them. Because I've realized that the true strength of our bond isn't in being identical or inseparable. It's in supporting each other as we become the people we're meant to be, together and individually. George turned to face Fred directly now. Fred, you're my twin, my best friend, my business partner, and the only person in the world who knows exactly how many Bertie Bott's beans can fit in Percy's dress shoes. This earned a laugh and an indignant, hey, from Percy. But more than anything, you're my brother. And that won't change whether we're pulling pranks together at Hogwarts or you're changing nappies while I'm doing whatever it is non-married people do with their freedom and disposable income. The crowd chuckled appreciatively. Angelina, George continued, turning to the bride, you're getting more than just a husband today. You're getting a lifetime supply of jokes with questionable timing, inventions that occasionally explode, and a man who will love you with every fiber of his being. Take care of him for me. Not because he needs taking care of, though Merlin knows he does, but because you make him happier than I've ever seen him. Angelina smiled through tears, nodding her promise. So, George raised his glass higher, to Fred and Angelina. May your journey together be filled with laughter, love, and just enough mischief to keep things interesting. And may you always remember that family, whether by blood or by choice, is the strongest magic of all. To Fred and Angelina, the crowd echoed, raising their glasses in a toast. As George took a sip of his champagne, Fred stepped onto the platform and pulled him into a careful hug, mindful of his injury. That, Fred said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, was not the embarrassing speech you promised. Oh, I've still got the embarrassing one, George assured him with a mischievous grin. I'm saving it for your first anniversary. Fred laughed, wiping suspiciously at his eyes. I'll hold you to that. The band struck up a new song, and Fred returned to Angelina for another dance. George remained seated, watching the celebration with a contented smile. Several guests stopped by to compliment his speech or inquire about his injury, but he was happy to observe from the sidelines for a while, letting the events of the day settle in his mind. He was so lost in thought that he didn't immediately notice Katie Bell approaching until she sat in the chair Fred had conjured next to his. "That was quite a speech," she said, offering him a fresh butterbeer. "Not what I expected from one half of Hogwarts' most notorious pranksters." George accepted the drink gratefully. "Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain." Katie smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners in the way he'd always found endearing. "Your secret's safe with me. How's the injury?" "Healer says I'll live, though dancing's off the table," George replied, then added impulsively, "which is a shame, because I was looking forward to asking you for one." Katie's eyebrows rose slightly, but her smile widened. "Well, there's always the next wedding. Any more siblings left to marry off?" "Just Ron and Hermione, but that's practically a foregone conclusion," George replied. "Though at the rate they argue, it might be years before he works up the nerve to propose." "I can wait," Katie said simply, her eyes meeting his with quiet sincerity. Something warm unfurled in George's chest, a feeling of possibility, of future, of paths yet to be explored. Before he could respond, however, a commotion near the entrance to the garden caught their attention. Ministry officials had arrived, led by Kingsley Shacklebolt himself. Their expressions were grave as they approached Harry, who had been dancing with Ginny. A brief, intense conversation followed, with Harry's face growing increasingly concerned. "Something's wrong," George murmured, setting down his butterbeer and pushing himself to his feet despite the protest from his side. Katie rose with him, steadying him with a hand on his arm. "Should you be standing?" "Probably not," George admitted, "but when has that ever stopped me?" They made their way toward the group, where Fred and Angelina had now joined Harry, Ron, and the ministry officials. George caught the tail end of Kingsley's explanation. "Escaped during transport. We believe she had inside help." "Who escaped?" George asked as he joined the circle. Harry turned to him, his expression grim. "Isla Rosier. She was being moved to Azkaban when the transport team was ambushed. 2 Aurors are dead." George felt a chill run down his spine. Isla Rosier had been the mastermind behind the Remnant, the one who had developed the plan to use the Anima Vinculum potion against the Weasleys. If she was free. "We need to secure the burrow," Fred said immediately, his arm tightening around Angelina's waist. "If she's targeting our family, already in progress," Kingsley assured him. "I've brought a team of Aurors to reinforce the protective enchantments. But there's something else you should know." He hesitated, exchanging a glance with Harry. "What?" George prompted, a sense of dread building in his stomach. "The ambush wasn't random," Harry explained. "According to the surviving Auror, Rosier said something before she disappeared. She said, 'Tell the Weasley twins their time is running out. The clock is ticking.'" Fred and George exchanged concerned glances. "The clock again?" Fred asked. "We checked our family clock," George reminded them. "Bill confirmed it's free from dark magic." "We're not taking any chances," Kingsley said firmly. "I've authorized a team from the Department of Mysteries to examine it thoroughly. They're setting up in the house now." "What about the guests?" Angelina asked, looking around at the reception that was continuing obliviously, the music and laughter creating a surreal contrast to their tense conversation. "We don't want to cause a panic," Kingsley replied. "For now, we're keeping security measures discreet. The additional Aurors are posing as guests or staff. But it might be wise to begin winding things down naturally." Fred nodded, his expression resolute. "We'll start the final dances, then the send-off. Most guests should be gone within the hour." "I'll check on the clock team," Harry offered. "See what they've found so far." As the group dispersed to their various tasks, George found himself alone with Fred for a moment. "Some wedding day, huh?" George said, attempting levity. Fred's laugh was strained. "Not exactly what I had in mind when I proposed. Though I suppose it's on brand for us, can't even get married without a life-or-death situation involved." "Angelina's handling it like a champion," George observed, glancing to where she was now speaking with her parents, her composure betraying nothing of the potential danger. "She's amazing," Fred agreed, his expression softening. "Dueled a dark wizard on our wedding day without breaking a sweat. I've definitely married up." "Way up," George confirmed with a grin. "Now go do your final dance. I'll coordinate with Bill and Charlie about guest departures." As Fred rejoined his wife, George made his way around the perimeter of the reception, discreetly informing family members of the situation. Bill immediately began strengthening the protective wards around the property, while Charlie positioned himself near the main entrance, ready to react if needed. Percy, upon being informed, suggested evacuating guests through the house's flow network rather than having them apparate from the garden. "If Rosier's watching the property, she'll see people disapparating and know we're emptying the reception." "Good thinking," George acknowledged, impressed once again by Percy's strategic mind. "Can you coordinate that? Make it seem natural, guests just heading home after the celebration." Percy nodded and headed toward the house, intercepting small groups of guests and guiding them inside with practiced diplomatic skill. George was checking in with Ron when Katie rejoined him, her expression concerned. "Something's happening, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "The Aurors are too casual about how they're watching the perimeter." George hesitated, torn between honesty and not wanting to worry her. "Just a precaution," he said finally. "Loose end from this afternoon's excitement." Katie gave him a flat look. "George Weasley, I fought in the Battle of Hogwarts. I can handle the truth." George couldn't help but smile despite the situation. "Fair point. Isla Rosier escaped custody. There's concern she might target the Weasley family clock again, we're not sure how. What can I do to help?" Katie asked immediately, no trace of fear in her voice. Before George could answer, the music stopped abruptly. Fred and Angelina stood on the small platform, arms around each other's waists, smiling at the assembled guests. "Thank you all for sharing this day with us," Fred announced, his voice carrying easily across the garden. Despite the unexpected entertainment earlier, a ripple of nervous laughter ran through the crowd. "This has been the happiest day of our lives. We'd like to finish the evening with a final dance, and then we'll be departing for our honeymoon. Please feel free to continue enjoying the refreshments inside, or head home if you've had enough excitement for one day." As the band struck up a slow, romantic melody, Fred led Angelina to the center of the dance floor for their final dance as the guests of honor. Other couples joined them, creating a perfect cover for the gradual evacuation Percy was orchestrating through the house. "Clever," Katie murmured. "Natural end to the reception without causing alarm." George nodded, scanning the garden for any sign of trouble. The Aurors were doing the same, their casual poses belied by the alertness in their eyes and the wands readily accessible in their hands or sleeves. The song ended to enthusiastic applause, and Fred and Angelina made their way around the remaining guests, saying quick goodbyes. George noticed they were steering people toward the house rather than the garden gate, another subtle evacuation tactic. Within 20 minutes, the crowd had thinned considerably. Only family members and close friends remained in the garden, along with the disguised Aurors. The band had packed up their instruments, and the enchanted lanterns were gradually dimming, signaling the natural end of the celebration. Harry emerged from the house, making his way directly to where George stood with Katie, Ron, and Hermione. "The Department of Mysteries team found something," he said without preamble, his voice low. "Not dark magic exactly, but a kind of echo. They think the duplicate clock left a magical residue on our family clock, not enough to control it, but enough to track it. So Rosier can find the burrow using the clock's signature?" Ron asked, alarmed. The wards would still keep her out, Hermione pointed out. Even with the clock connection, she can't just walk in. Unless the connection is stronger than we realize, George said slowly, pieces clicking together in his mind. The anima vinculum potion creates bonds between objects and life forces. What if Rosier found a way to use that bond in reverse? Harry's expression darkened. You think she could use the residual connection to bypass the wards, like Blackwood did? It's possible, George admitted. We should move the clock, get it away from the burrow until we understand exactly what we're dealing with. Already happening, Harry assured him. Kingsley's team is preparing to transport it to the Department of Mysteries for thorough examination and cleansing. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Kingsley approached their group, accompanied by Bill. The clock's been secured for transport, he informed them. The evacuation is nearly complete. Once the clock is safely away, I suggest the family relocate temporarily as well, at least until we've apprehended Rosier. Relocate where? Ron asked. The entire remnant knows about all our family properties. Shell Cottage, Bill suggested. It's under the Fidelius charm, and I'm the secret keeper. They can't find it even if they know it exists. Kingsley nodded approvingly. Perfect. I'll have an Auror team escort everyone there once. A tremendous crash interrupted him as the back door of the burrow burst open. One of the ministry officials staggered out, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead. She's here, he gasped before collapsing. Everything happened at once. Aurors moved into defensive positions, wands drawn. Bill and Charlie flanked Molly and Arthur, shielding them with protective spells. Percy pulled Audrey behind a stone wall, while Ron and Harry stepped in front of Hermione and Ginny despite their protests. Fred appeared at George's side, having pushed Angelina toward her parents with instructions to get inside the burrow's reinforced kitchen. Where's the clock team? George asked urgently. Still inside, Harry replied, already moving toward the house. They were in the living room, preparing the transport container. Before anyone could stop him, George was running toward the house, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side. Fred swore and followed, keeping pace despite his formal dress shoes slipping on the damp grass. They burst through the back door together, wands raised, to find chaos in the normally cozy living room. 2 Department of Mysteries workers lay unconscious or worse on the floor. The special containment unit they had brought for the clock had been shattered, its magical seals broken. And standing by the family clock, one hand resting possessively on its face, was Isla Rosier. She looked different from when George had spied on her at the estate, wilder, her steel-gray hair escaping its severe bun, her eyes gleaming with fanatical light. But her voice was still cold and precise as she greeted them. Ah, the famous Weasley twins. Right on time. Step away from the clock, Rosier, Fred demanded, his wand aimed steadily at her heart. She smiled thinly. I think not. We have unfinished business, you and I. Your business partner Blackwood is dead, George informed her, edging sideways to get a better angle. The duplicate clock is destroyed. It's over. Over. Rosier laughed, the sound utterly devoid of humor. You understand nothing. The clock was merely a tool, a means to an end. The true magic lies in the potion, in the bonds it creates and breaks. As she spoke, her hand remained on the clock, her fingers tracing the hands that showed the location of each Weasley family member. George noticed with growing unease that all the hands were slowly moving toward mortal peril, even though most of the family was safely outside. What have you done to it? He demanded, taking another step closer. Not what I've done, Rosier corrected. What I'm doing. The anima vinculum works by manipulating connections, by strengthening or severing the bonds between people, objects, or places. Her fingers caressed Fred's hand on the clock face. Your family has always drawn strength from these bonds. What happens, I wonder, when they're cut? Understanding dawned on George with horrifying clarity. You're using the clock to sever our family bonds. Very good, Rosier praised mockingly. Not just the physical connections, the magical ones. The ties of blood and love and shared history that make you Weasleys so disgustingly resilient. By midnight, those bonds will be completely dissolved. You'll be strangers to each other, your shared memories meaningless, your love turned to indifference. The ultimate punishment for blood traitors, to lose the very family they chose over their proper place in wizarding society. Fred took a step forward, rage contorting his features, but George caught his arm, stopping him. That's not how family works, George said, addressing Rosier directly. You can't erase bonds with a spell or a potion. They're not just in our memories or our magic, they're in who we are, in every choice we've made. Rosier's expression hardened. Sentimental nonsense. Magic can break anything, given the right application. And I've had years to perfect this particular magic. As they talked, George was acutely aware of movement behind them, Harry and the others entering the house cautiously, taking positions just out of Rosier's line of sight. They needed to keep her distracted. Why us? Fred asked, seemingly catching on to George's stalling tactic. Why the Weasley family specifically? Something flickered in Rosier's eyes, an old pain, quickly masked by hatred. Your father, she spat. Arthur Weasley and his ridiculous Muggle Protection Act. Do you know what it did to families like mine? Properties seized, heirlooms confiscated, fortunes depleted to pay reparations to mudbloods and blood traitors. The act targeted illegal dark artifacts, George pointed out. If your family lost possessions, it's because they were dangerous or obtained illegally. They were our birthright. Rosier hissed, her composure cracking. Magical objects that had been in our family for generations, taken by ministry lackeys who couldn't begin to understand their power or significance. And your father led the charge, smiling that self-righteous smile while destroying centuries of pure-blood heritage. As she grew more agitated, her grip on the clock tightened, her knuckles whitening. The clock's hands were moving faster now, all pointing firmly at mortal peril. And you thought the appropriate response was to destroy his family? Fred asked incredulously. Bit extreme, isn't it? Justice, Rosier corrected. Poetic justice. He took what mattered most to us, so we take what matters most to him. But not through death, that's too simple, too clean. No, Arthur Weasley will live to see his precious family disintegrate around him, each member forgetting their connections, their shared past, their love for one another. He'll be alone in a crowd of strangers who once bore his name. George felt sick at the twisted logic, but he kept her talking, aware that Harry and Kingsley were now in position on either side of the room. And the wedding? He asked. Why target Fred and Angelina specifically? A marriage creates new bonds, Rosier explained, almost professorial in her tone despite the madness in her eyes. New connections that could potentially resist the potion's effects. We couldn't risk that. Better to eliminate the threat before the vows were completed. She smiled coldly at Fred. Though I suppose congratulations are in order. You managed to marry her after all, for all the good it will do you when midnight strikes. What makes you think we'll let you reach midnight? Fred challenged, his wand never wavering from her heart. Rosier's smile widened. Because you can't stop me without destroying the clock. And if the clock is destroyed while under the influence of the anima vinculum, the severance happens instantly and permanently. Your family bonds would be irrevocably broken. It was a perfect trap. They couldn't attack her directly without risking damage to the clock. They couldn't remove the clock from her influence without triggering the immediate severance of their family bonds. And they couldn't simply wait, because midnight would bring the same result. George and Fred exchanged glances, a lifetime of silent communication allowing them to formulate a plan without words. It was risky, potentially catastrophic if it failed, but they had no other options. You're forgetting something, Rosier, George said, taking a deliberate step to the left, drawing her attention. The anima vinculum works on existing connections. It can strengthen them, manipulate them, even sever them. But it can't create something that isn't there to begin with. Rosier frowned, confusion momentarily replacing the fanatical gleam in her eyes. What are you babbling about? Family bonds, Fred continued, taking a step to the right, forcing Rosier to divide her attention between them. They're not just magic. They're not just blood. They're a choice we make every day. A choice that can't be undone by a potion or a spell, George added. Because it exists outside of magic, in who we are at our core. Rosier laughed dismissively. Charming sentiments. But the anima vinculum has severed bonds far stronger than your family's petty affections. Ancient magical bloodlines, generational curses, even life debts, all broken by its power. Maybe, Fred acknowledged, taking another step to the side. But there's one bond you can't break, because you don't understand it. You've never experienced it. And what might that be? Rosier asked mockingly. The bond between twins, George and Fred said in perfect unison, their voices blending as they had so many times before. In that moment, they moved as one. Fred cast a powerful shield charm directly between Rosier and the clock, while George sent a precise severing charm at the magical connection he could now see pulsing between Rosier's hand and the clock's face, a sickly green thread of energy that linked them. The combination worked exactly as they'd hoped. The shield charm prevented Rosier from physically touching the clock, while the severing charm cut the magical connection without damaging the clock itself. Rosier screamed in fury and pain as the connection was severed, a backlash of magical energy sending her staggering backward. In that moment of distraction, Harry and Kingsley struck simultaneously. Stupefy. Incarcerus. The combined spells hit Rosier square in the chest, stunning her instantly and binding her in magical ropes. She collapsed to the floor, unconscious but still breathing, her face frozen in an expression of rage and disbelief. For a moment, no one moved, the tension of the confrontation still hanging in the air. Then Fred stepped carefully around Rosier's prone form to examine the family clock. Did it work? George asked, joining him. Is the connection broken? Fred studied the clock face, where the hands were slowly moving away from mortal peril and back to their proper positions. I think so. Look, they're returning to normal. Indeed, Molly and Arthur's hands were shifting to home, while Bill's moved to traveling, as he presumably headed back to Shell Cottage to secure it for the family. Percy's hand pointed to work, suggesting he had gone to the ministry to file immediate reports. The bond-severing spell, Harry asked urgently, did she manage to activate it at all? George looked at Fred, searching his twin's face for any sign that their connection had been damaged or altered. Fred met his gaze steadily, the familiar mischievous spark still present in his eyes. Still feel like my incredibly annoying twin brother to me, Fred confirmed with a relieved grin. And you're still the less handsome, less intelligent version of me, George replied cheerfully. So I'd say we're intact. Kingsley was securing Rosier with additional binding spells, taking no chances with her second capture. We'll need the Department of Mysteries to examine the clock thoroughly, make sure there are no lingering effects. But I believe you managed to interrupt the spell before it could take hold. The tension in the room gradually dissipated as ministry officials arrived to take Rosier into custody, this time with significantly enhanced security measures. The injured workers were tended to by healers, and plans were made to move the clock to a secure location for cleansing and examination. Through it all, Fred and George remained by the clock, as if their presence could protect it from further harm. It wasn't until Angelina entered the living room, her face tight with worry, that Fred finally stepped away. Is it over? She asked, moving to his side. Really over this time? Fred pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Really over. Rosier's caught, the clock is safe, and the remnant is officially disbanded. Good, Angelina said firmly. Because we have a honeymoon to start, and I'm not postponing it for any more dark wizards, cursed objects, or world-ending catastrophes. Fred laughed, the sound lighter and more carefree than it had been all day. Yes, ma'am. Just let me say goodbye to the family, and we can be on our way. As the immediate crisis passed, the remaining Weasleys gathered in the garden to bid farewell to the newlyweds. Molly was tearful but composed, embracing both Fred and Angelina with fierce affection. Arthur shook Fred's hand formally, then pulled him into a hug that conveyed everything words couldn't. George stood slightly apart, watching the family interactions with a new appreciation. The clock incident had underscored what he'd already begun to understand, that family bonds weren't just magical or biological. They were built through choices, through shared experiences, through the daily decision to love and support one another. When it was his turn to say goodbye, George found himself momentarily speechless as he faced Fred. Well, he finally managed, you did it. Married the girl of your dreams and defeated a dark wizard conspiracy all in one day. Setting the bar rather high for the rest of us, aren't you? Fred grinned. Just keeping things interesting. Can't have people thinking the Weasley twins have gone soft in their old age. Speak for yourself, old man, George retorted. I'm still in my prime. They looked at each other for a long moment, 25 years of shared history passing between them in a single glance. Thank you, Fred said finally, his voice uncharacteristically serious. For everything. For saving my life. For being my best man. For understanding that things are changing but not ending. Always, George replied simply. Then, unable to maintain the serious tone for long, he added, but if you come back with a tan and I don't, I'll never forgive you. Fred laughed and pulled him into a careful hug, mindful of his injury. Take care of that side. And maybe take care of yourself for once, too. You deserve some happiness of your own, you know. I'll work on it, George promised, glancing briefly toward where Katie was chatting with Ginny, her laugh carrying across the garden. The goodbyes complete, Fred and Angelina departed via Port Key, a golden snitch that would transport them directly to their honeymoon destination, a small wizarding resort on a private Greek island. As they disappeared in a swirl of light, George felt a curious mixture of emotions, joy for his twins' happiness, relief that the danger had passed, and a new sense of anticipation for his own future, whatever it might hold. They'll be all right, you know, came a gentle voice beside him. Katie had approached while he was lost in thought. Fred and Angelina. They're perfect for each other. I know, George agreed, surprising himself with how genuinely he meant it. And I couldn't be happier for them. And you? Katie asked, studying his face. Will you be all right? George considered the question seriously. For 5 years, he'd defined himself primarily in relation to Fred, as a twin, a business partner, the other half of a matched set. Now, as their paths began to diverge, he was discovering parts of himself that existed independently of that relationship. Yeah, he said finally, a slow smile spreading across his face. I think I will be. Better than all right, actually. Katie's answering smile was warm and inviting. Good. Because I was thinking, once you're healed up, maybe we could have that dance you mentioned. Doesn't have to be at a wedding. I'd like that, George replied, surprised by how much he meant it. Though fair warning, I have my brother's sense of rhythm, which is to say, none at all. I'll take my chances, Katie laughed. I've survived one Weasley twin wedding. How much more dangerous could a dance be? As the evening deepened into night, the remaining guests and family members gradually dispersed. The burrow, which had witnessed so much joy and danger in a single day, settled back into its usual comfortable chaos. George found himself in the living room, staring at the empty space where the family clock had stood for as long as he could remember. The ministry had taken it for safekeeping and cleansing, promising to return it within a few days once they were certain all traces of Rosier's magic had been removed. Feels strange, doesn't it? Arthur said, entering the room quietly. Not having it there. George nodded. Like the house is holding its breath. Arthur moved to stand beside his son, both of them contemplating the vacant spot on the wall. You know, That clock has been in the family for 4 generations. My grandfather enchanted it himself when he and my grandmother had their first child. He wanted a way to keep track of everyone, to know they were safe. I never knew that, George admitted. The magic in it isn't just spell work, Arthur continued. It's intention. It's love. That's why Rosier's plan was ultimately doomed to fail. You can't sever bonds that are reinforced every day through choice and action. George glanced at his father, struck by the simple wisdom in his words. You know, for someone who collects plug adapters and gets excited about rubber ducks, you're occasionally quite profound, Dad. Arthur chuckled, placing a hand on George's shoulder. Don't tell your mother. She thinks I'm just a silly old man with peculiar hobbies. Your secret's safe with me, George promised with a grin. They stood in companionable silence for a moment longer before Arthur spoke again. I'm proud of you, son. Of both of you, of course, but especially of you today. George raised an eyebrow in surprise. Me? Fred's the one who got married and started the next chapter of his life. Yes, and that's wonderful, Arthur agreed. But you're doing something equally important and possibly more difficult. You're finding your own path while still supporting his. That takes a special kind of courage. The word settled warmly in George's chest, acknowledging something he hadn't quite articulated to himself yet. Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. Arthur squeezed his shoulder gently. Now, you should get some rest. That side won't heal properly if you keep pushing yourself. And I have a feeling the shop will be exceptionally busy tomorrow with everyone wanting first-hand accounts of the Battle of the Wedding, as your brother Charlie is already calling it. George laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet house. I'll turn in soon. Just want to enjoy the peace for a bit longer. After Arthur left, George remained in the living room, thinking about the day's events and what they represented. Fred's wedding marked more than just his brother's union with Angelina. It symbolized a turning point for both of them, a step into new territories, new identities, new possibilities. For the first time since the Battle of Hogwarts, George felt completely at peace with that idea. Their paths might diverge, but they would always run parallel, connected by something deeper than magic or blood or shared experiences. The bond between them was a choice they made every day, to support each other, to celebrate each other's happiness, to face dangers together when needed and separately when appropriate. It was a bond that couldn't be severed by potions or spells because it existed in the very core of who they were, individually and together. As George finally headed upstairs to his old room, now cleared of wedding preparations and returned to its familiar state, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that. Fred would return from his honeymoon, they would continue building their joke shop empire, and life would go on. But it would go on differently now, with Fred and Angelina creating their own family, with George exploring possibilities he hadn't considered before, with all of them growing and changing while remaining anchored to each other. And that, George reflected as he drifted toward sleep, was exactly as it should be. The future stretched before him, not as Fred and George, the inseparable unit, but as George Weasley, twin brother, business partner, friend, and perhaps someday husband and father in his own right. It was a future full of possibilities, of separate but parallel paths, of bonds that would stretch but never break. It was, in short, a future worth fighting for. Worth living for. Worth celebrating in all its unknown potential. And as the burrows settled into nighttime silence around him, George smiled, embracing that future with open arms. 3 months later, the bell above the door of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes jingled cheerfully as George looked up from the counter where he was demonstrating the latest version of extendable ears to an enthusiastic group of Hogwarts students. And these new models can translate up to 7 different languages, though we're still working out a few kinks with the Mermish setting, he was explaining when a familiar voice cut through the shop noise. Don't believe a word he says, kids. Last time I used the Mermish version, I could only communicate through interpretive dance for 3 days. George's face split into a wide grin as Fred made his way through the crowded shop, looking tanned and relaxed after his extended honeymoon. Only because you ignored the very clear warning label, George retorted, coming around the counter to greet his twin with a brief but enthusiastic hug. Welcome back. How was the island? How's Angelina? Did you bring me anything expensive? Fred laughed, returning the hug with equal enthusiasm. Brilliant, fantastic, and yes, but it's probably illegal in 7 countries, so I'll show you upstairs. The students watched this exchange with undisguised interest. The famous Weasley twins' reunion was apparently worth eavesdropping on, until George shooed them away with promises of discounts if they returned after classes. The place looks great, Fred observed, glancing around at the shop, which had undergone some renovations during his absence. The layout had been expanded, with a new section dedicated to defensive magic products and another showcasing what appeared to be educational toys disguised as pranking items. Verity's idea, George explained, following his gaze to the educational section. Parents love buying things that might accidentally teach their kids something. We've sold out of the exploding equations 3 times already. They headed upstairs to the flat above the shop, which had also changed somewhat. The space that had once been cluttered with product prototypes and shared living arrangements was now clearly divided, with one half neatly organized as an office space while the other remained George's living quarters. We've expanded to the building next door, George explained as he put on the kettle for tea. Knocked through the wall on the 3rd floor. I've kept the flat above the shop, and the new space will be perfect for you and Angelina whenever you're ready to move in. About that, Fred said, accepting the offered cup of tea. We've been talking, and we're thinking of getting a place in Hogsmeade instead. Close enough to run the branch shop, but with a bit more space than we'd have here. A few months ago, this news might have unsettled George. Now, he nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. The Hogsmeade branch is doing brilliantly, and the commute would be easier. He grinned. Plus, you'd be closer to Hogwarts for when your future children inevitably get detention for following in their father's troublemaking footsteps. Fred choked slightly on his tea. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've only been married 3 months. Speaking of which, George said, leaning forward eagerly, tell me everything. How was the extended honeymoon? Did you actually see any of the sights, or did you just stay in your villa the whole time? Fred launched into animated descriptions of their adventures, exploring ancient magical ruins on remote Greek islands, swimming with merpeople in crystal-clear waters, and yes, spending plenty of time simply enjoying each other's company in their private villa. George listened attentively, genuinely happy for his brother's joy. Enough about me, Fred said finally. What's been happening here? Apart from the shop expansion and apparently revolutionizing magical education through pranking. George filled him in on the past 3 months, the capture and trial of the remaining remnant members, all sentenced to lengthy terms in Azkaban, the successful cleansing and return of the family clock, and the various developments in their friends' and families' lives. And what about you? Fred asked, studying his twin's face. You seem different. Good different. George smiled, recognizing the observation for what it was, Fred's way of asking about his emotional state without being too direct. I am good, he confirmed. Really good, actually. The shop's thriving, I'm developing new product lines, and... He hesitated briefly, then continued, I've been seeing Katie. Nothing official yet, but we've been spending time together. Fred's face lit up. I knew it. I told Angelina you two would end up together. That's fantastic, George. It's early days, George cautioned, though he couldn't suppress his smile. But yeah, it's been nice. Different, having someone who's interested in just me, not Fred and George, as a package deal. She always could tell us apart, Fred remembered. Even back at Hogwarts. They lapsed into comfortable silence, sipping their tea and enjoying the simple pleasure of being in each other's company again. After a while, Fred spoke up, his tone more serious. I was worried, you know. About leaving you for so long right after everything that happened at the wedding. About what moving to Hogsmeade might mean for us, for the business. George nodded, understanding completely. I worried too, for a while. But I think we needed this space, this time to figure out who we are apart from each other. And who are we? Fred asked, genuinely curious. George considered the question. Still Fred and George Weasley, he said finally. Still twins, still brothers, still best friends and business partners. But also individuals with our own lives, our own relationships, our own paths to follow. Fred raised his teacup in a toast. To Fred and George Weasley, together and apart, whichever way the situation calls for. I'll drink to that, George agreed, clinking his cup against his twins. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the flat above Weasley's wizard wheezes, illuminating the two identical, yet increasingly different, men sharing tea and stories and plans for the future, one thing was abundantly clear: some bonds couldn't be severed, no matter what magic was thrown at them. The Weasley twins had survived a war, a near-death experience, marriage, separation, and an attempt to magically break their family bonds. They had emerged not just intact, but stronger, their connection transformed and deepened by the very things that might have threatened it. And that, perhaps, was the greatest magic of all. The end. Thank you for watching this video. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video.